World War II wasn't just a war. It was the most catastrophic conflict in human history, a global inferno that consumed entire continents and changed the world forever. From 1939 to 1945, over 100 million people were mobilized for combat. 70 to 85 million people died, roughly 3% of the world's population at the time. Cities were reduced to rubble. Empires collapsed, new superpowers emerged, and the atomic age began with mushroom clouds over Japan. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't just a war between a handful of major powers. 59 countries were directly involved in World War II. That's almost a third of all nations that existed at the time. From the frozen tundra of Finland to the jungles of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the war touched every inhabited continent. Some nations fought from the first day to the last. Others were dragged in against their will. Some switched sides midway through. Some maintained precarious neutrality while secretly helping one side or the other. Every country has its own story of courage, tragedy, betrayal, and survival. The massive industrial might of the United States, the desperate resistance of Poland, the technological innovations of Germany, the unimaginable sacrifice of the Soviet Union, the brutal expansion of Japan, the legendary partisans of Yugoslavia, the water saboteurs of Norway, the suicide pilots of Japan, the codebreakers of Britain, the atomic scientists racing against time. This is the complete story of all 59 countries involved in World War II, their conflicts, their invasions, their secrets, and their curiosities, the major powers and the forgotten nations, the victors and the defeated, the heroes and the villains. Welcome to the most comprehensive look at every nation that shaped the deadliest war in human history. Germany stands at the center of World War II, the nation whose aggression ignited the global conflict and whose defeat would cost tens of millions of lives. Under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, Germany transformed from a defeated, economically crippled nation after World War I into a military juggernaut that conquered most of Europe in just 2 years. Hitler rose to power in 1933, exploiting economic depression, national humiliation from the Versailles Treaty, and deep-seated anti-Semitism. He rebuilt Germany's military in violation of treaty restrictions, remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, seized Czechoslovakia, and then invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering the war. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics revolutionized warfare. Lightning War combined tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry in coordinated assaults that overwhelmed enemies before they could respond. Poland fell in weeks, Denmark and Norway in 1940. Then came the stunning conquest of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in just 6 weeks. Something Germany had failed to achieve in 4 years during World War I. The German military seemed invincible, but Hitler's greatest gamble came on June 22, 1941. With Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in history, crashed across the Soviet border. Initial successes were spectacular. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Vast territories fell. But the invasion stalled before Moscow in the brutal winter of 1941. The turning point came at Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943. The bloodiest battle in human history, over 2 million casualties in urban combat that destroyed an entire German army. Germany never recovered. Hitler's regime committed the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in concentration and death camps. This genocide, carried out with industrial efficiency, represents humanity's darkest chapter. Germany also produced remarkable military technology, the first operational jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, advanced submarines, and came frighteningly close to developing atomic weapons. German scientists and engineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible, though ultimately their innovations couldn't overcome strategic mistakes and numerical superiority of the Allies. Japan transformed World War II into a truly global conflict by attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. But Japan's war had begun much earlier, with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and full-scale war against China starting in 1937. The Japanese Empire sought to create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for Japanese domination of Asia and the Pacific. Japan's military culture emphasized honor, loyalty to the emperor, and death before surrender. This produced soldiers who fought with fanatical determination but also committed horrific atrocities. The rape of Nanking in 1937 saw Japanese troops massacre hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in an orgy of violence. Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia in 1941 and 1942 was breathtakingly rapid. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all fell in months. The British surrender at Singapore, where 80,000 troops surrendered to a smaller Japanese force, was described as the worst defeat in British military history. Japan seemed unstoppable in the Pacific. But the tide turned at Midway in June 1942, where American forces sank for Japanese aircraft carriers in a single battle. From then on, Japan faced the overwhelming industrial might of the United States in a war of attrition it couldn't win. As defeat loomed, Japan employed kamikaze suicide pilots who deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Nearly 4,000 kamikaze attacks killed thousands of Allied sailors and demonstrated the extreme measures Japan would take. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally forced Japan's surrender, ending the war but beginning the nuclear age. Italy under Benito Mussolini was the third Axis power, though far less effective militarily than Germany or Japan. Mussolini, who had seized power in 1922 and established the first fascist dictatorship, dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire. He invaded Ethiopia in 1935, using poison gas against poorly equipped defenders, and annexed Albania in 1939, when Germany invaded France in 1940. Mussolini opportunistically declared war on France and Britain, hoping to grab territory from France's collapse. But Italian military performance was consistently poor. An invasion of Greece from Albania in October 1940 turned into a humiliating defeat when Greek forces pushed the Italians back and occupied part of Albania. Germany had to rescue Italy, delaying Hitler's invasion of Russia. In North Africa, Italian forces in Libya were routed by much smaller British forces. Again, Germany had to intervene, sending Rommel and the Afrika Korps. Italian troops fought in Russia but were poorly equipped for the brutal Eastern Front. By 1943, Italians were exhausted and demoralized. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 led to Mussolini's overthrow. Italy's new government surrendered in September 1943 and switched sides, joining the Allies. But Germany occupied most of Italy, and fighting continued until April 1945. Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body hung upside down in Milan. Italy's war revealed the limits of fascist rhetoric when confronted with military reality. The United States entered World War II as a reluctant giant and emerged as a superpower. After World War I, Americans wanted nothing to do with European conflicts. Isolationism dominated, but Pearl Harbor changed everything. The surprise Japanese attack killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States, bringing America into both the European and Pacific theaters. America's contribution to victory was immense and multifaceted. Industrial production reached levels that seemed impossible. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and thousands of ships. The arsenal of democracy supplied not just American forces but also Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies through Lend-Lease. American troops fought in North Africa, Italy, Western Europe, and across the Pacific. D-Day. The Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, was primarily an American and British operation that opened the Western Front and began liberation of Western Europe. In the Pacific, American forces island-hopped toward Japan, fighting brutal battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Manhattan Project, America's secret atomic bomb program, employed over 130,000 people and cost $2 billion. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 killed over 200,000 people but ended the war, without the need for a ground invasion of Japan that would have cost millions of lives. America's relatively light casualties, about 400,000 dead compared to tens of millions for other major powers, and its intact industrial base positioned it as the world's dominant superpower after the war. The United Kingdom stood alone against Nazi Germany from France's fall in June 1940 until Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Britain refused Hitler's peace offers and fought on despite seemingly hopeless odds. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over England from July to October 1940, saw the Royal Air Force defeat the German Luftwaffe, preventing a German invasion. Churchill's speeches rallied the nation with phrases like "We shall fight on the beaches and never surrender." The Blitz, Germany's bombing campaign against British cities, killed over 40,000 civilians but failed to break British morale. Britain's navy maintained control of sea lanes, though German U-boats came frighteningly close to cutting supply lines in the Battle of the Atlantic. British forces fought in North Africa where they defended Egypt and the Suez Canal. The victory at El Alamein in 1942 was, as Churchill said, the end of the beginning. British intelligence achievements were crucial. Bletchley Park codebreakers, including Alan Turing, cracked German Enigma codes, providing intelligence that shortened the war by years. British commandos and special operations conducted raids and sabotage across occupied Europe. The evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940, where over 300,000 Allied soldiers were rescued from the French coast, became a symbol of British resilience. Britain sacrificed enormously, emerging from the war victorious but economically exhausted. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the world began its dissolution, as colonies sought independence and Britain could no longer afford to maintain its global position. The war cost Britain over 450,000 lives and left it dependent on American support. marking the transition from British to American global leadership. The Soviet Union suffered more than any other nation in World War II, with casualties estimated between 24 and 27 million people, roughly 15% of its entire population. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939 shocked the world, as Communist Russia and Fascist Germany agreed not to attack each other and secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Stalin used this pact to seize eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Finland and Romania. But on June 22, 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin with Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed across a 2,000-mile front. Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared, despite warnings. Millions were killed or captured in the first months. By December, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege, and it seemed the Soviet Union would collapse. But the Soviets held. The brutal Russian winter, vast distances, and desperate Soviet resistance stopped the German advance. Stalin moved entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains, rebuilding Soviet industry out of German reach. Soviet production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft eventually surpassed Germany's. The turning point came at Stalingrad, where Soviet forces under Marshal Zhukov executed Operation Uranus, encircling and destroying Germany's 6th Army. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, saw the Soviets defeat Germany's last major offensive and begin the long push westward. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days, from September 1941 to January 1944, starving over 1 million civilians to death. Soviet forces endured unimaginable hardships, fighting through winter cold that froze weapons and men, through mud that swallowed vehicles, through urban ruins where every building became a fortress. Soviet women served in combat roles unprecedented in other armies, as pilots, snipers, tank crews, and infantry. The Night Witches, female bomber pilots, flew obsolete biplanes on night harassment missions. Soviet partisans behind German lines conducted sabotage and intelligence gathering, tying down German forces. By 1945, Soviet forces had pushed through Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. They captured Berlin in April 1945 after brutal street fighting. Soviet victory came at a cost almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities were destroyed. Agricultural land was devastated. A generation of young men was decimated. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, occupying Eastern Europe and beginning the Cold War with its former ally, the United States. China has been called a forgotten ally, but China's war with Japan was brutal beyond imagination and tied down massive Japanese forces that otherwise could have been used against the United States and Britain. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Though Japan had already occupied Manchuria since 1931, Japanese forces quickly captured Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanking, where they committed the Rape of Nanking, massacring hundreds of thousands of civilians in acts of deliberate brutality designed to terrorize the Chinese population. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek retreated into China's interior, establishing a capital at Chongqing. The Chinese strategy became trading space for time, giving up territory to preserve the army and wait for international support. China's geography, vast distances, and massive population made complete Japanese conquest impossible. Japanese forces could capture cities and rail lines but couldn't control the countryside. Chinese resistance was divided between Chiang's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, who sometimes fought each other almost as much as they fought Japan. Still, China tied down over 1 million Japanese troops who couldn't be used in the Pacific. Chinese soldiers fought with courage and determination despite being poorly equipped and supplied. The Burma Road, a supply line from British Burma to China, became China's lifeline for Allied support until Japan cut it in 1942. American General Joseph Stilwell advised Chinese forces and worked to improve their effectiveness, though relations with Chiang were often difficult. Chinese civilians suffered horribly under Japanese occupation. Forced labor, mass executions, biological warfare experiments, and systematic rape terrorized the population. The Three Alls policy was a harsh strategy used by Japanese forces in response to continued Chinese resistance. The conflict resulted in an immense human cost, with estimates suggesting that between 10 and 20 million Chinese civilians lost their lives during the war, one of the highest civilian tolls of any country involved. When Japan surrendered in 1945, China had already endured 8 years of intense conflict in Asian front, often overshadowed by events in Europe, yet equally destructive. The struggle left the country weakened and deeply divided, paving the way for the renewed civil conflict between nationalists and communists, forces that would shape the formation of modern China. France experienced a swift military defeat that led to years of foreign control and cooperation by parts of the government, but it also became known for its remarkable resistance efforts. At the time of the German attack on May 10, 1940, France was widely regarded as having one of the strongest armies in the world. However, rapid German offensive tactics pushed through the Ardennes-Florestan area, long considered difficult to penetrate, moving around the Maginot Line and surrounding Allied forces. Within just 6 weeks, France was defeated. More than 1.5 million French soldiers were captured during the conflict. On June 22, 1940, % agreed to an armistice signed in the same railway carriage used for Germany's 1918 surrender, a symbolic choice made by the German leadership. After the agreement, Germany took direct control of northern and western France. The southern region came under the administration of the Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Although it claimed to preserve French authority, it cooperated closely with Germany. During this period, the regime supported German directives, including the detention and transfer of targeted groups and the forced relocation of French laborers to work in Germany. Some Vichy forces even fought against the Allies in Syria and North Africa, but not all French accepted defeat. General Charles de Gaulle escaped to Britain and rallied Free French forces to continue fighting. The French resistance, operating inside occupied France, conducted sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla warfare. Resistance networks helped downed Allied pilots escape, gathered intelligence on German fortifications before D-Day, and disrupted German communications and transportation. The resistance was politically diverse, including everyone from conservative Catholics to communists, united by opposition to German occupation. When the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, French resistance forces rose up across the country, disrupting German response and liberating parts of France. Paris rose in rebellion before Allied forces arrived, with resistance fighters battling German forces in the streets. De Gaulle entered Paris in triumph on August 25, 1944. After liberation, France dealt harshly with collaborators. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public humiliation. Thousands were executed, some after proper trials, others by vigilante justice. France emerged from the war liberated but traumatized, its army defeated, its empire beginning to crumble, and its people divided by the memories of occupation and collaboration. Poland was where World War II began and where some of the war's worst atrocities occurred. Germany invaded from the west on September 1, 1939, and the Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17, carving up Poland between them according to the Nazi-Soviet pact. Polish forces fought bravely but were overwhelmed by numerical superiority and blitzkrieg tactics. The Polish cavalry charge against German tanks, often depicted as quixotic foolishness, was actually a reasonably successful attack against infantry that was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of armored vehicles. Polish forces continued fighting even after the government fled. Warsaw held out until September 28. Despite heavy bombardment, Poland suffered under brutal occupation. Germany treated Poles as subhuman Slavs fit only for slave labor. The intelligentsia, clergy, and leadership were systematically murdered in an attempt to destroy Polish culture. The Katyń massacre saw Soviet forces murder over 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals, a crime Stalin blamed on Germany until the truth emerged decades later. Poland became the center of the Holocaust. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other death camps on Polish soil murdered millions of Jews from across Europe. Over 3 million Polish Jews, 90% of Poland's pre-war Jewish population, were killed. 3 million non-Jewish Poles also died, making Poland's death toll 6 million total, proportionally among the highest of any nation. Yet Polish resistance was fierce and continuous. The Polish underground state created a secret government and army that conducted intelligence operations, sabotage, and eventually open warfare. Polish codebreakers had cracked German Enigma codes before the war and shared their methods with Britain, contributing to Allied intelligence success. Polish pilots flew with the RAF during the Battle of Britain, with some squadrons achieving the highest kill rates. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 saw the Polish Home Army rise against German occupation, hoping to liberate Warsaw before Soviet forces arrived. For 63 days, Poles fought desperately while Soviet forces waited across the river, allowing Germans to crush the uprising. Over 200,000 Poles died, and Warsaw was systematically destroyed. Poland emerged from the war devastated, its borders shifted westward, and under Soviet domination, liberation from Nazi Germany replaced by Soviet control. Canada punched far above its weight in World War II, contributing forces to nearly every major Allied campaign despite having a population of only 11 million. Canada declared war on Germany independently on September 10, 1939, a week after Britain, asserting its sovereignty while standing with the Commonwealth. Canadian forces fought in Hong Kong, where they faced the first Japanese attacks. They fought in the disastrous Dieppe raid of August 1942, where over 900 Canadians died in a failed amphibious assault that taught painful lessons later applied at On D-Day itself, Canadian forces assaulted Juno Beach, one of the 5 landing zones in Normandy. Despite fierce German resistance, Canadians penetrated further inland on the first day than any other Allied force. Fighting with skill and determination through the hedgerows of Normandy and beyond, Canadian forces played a crucial role in liberating the Netherlands, where they're still honored and remembered with deep gratitude. Every year, the Netherlands sends thousands of tulip bulbs to Canada in thanks. The liberation of the Netherlands cost over 7,000 Canadian lives but freed millions from Nazi occupation and starvation. Canadian pilots flew in the Battle of Britain and throughout the air war over Europe. Canada hosted the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, training over 130,000 Allied aircrew at schools across Canada, far from German bombing. Canadian industry produced ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons that supplied Allied forces. The Canadian Merchant Navy, often overlooked, suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any service, with 1 in 8 merchant mariners killed in the Battle of the Atlantic. Canadian destroyers and corvettes escorted convoys across the Atlantic, fighting German U-boats in freezing, dangerous conditions. Over 1 million Canadians served in uniform out of a population of 11 million, and over 45,000 died. Canada emerged from the war with a powerful military, expanded industry, and increased international stature, no longer seen as just a British dominion but as a significant nation in its own right. Australia found itself directly threatened by Japanese expansion and contributed forces to campaigns across the Pacific and in North Africa. Australian troops, known as diggers, established a reputation as tough, skilled fighters. In North Africa, Australian forces played key roles in campaigns against Italian and German forces. The Siege of Tobruk, where Australian troops held the Libyan port against German and Italian forces for over 7 months in 1941, earned them the nickname the Rats of Tobruk, a term they wore with pride. Australian divisions fought in the crucial Battle of El Alamein and throughout the North African campaign. When Japan entered the war, Australia faced a direct threat. Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin and other northern Australian cities. Japanese submarines operated in Australian waters, even shelling Sydney. Australian forces fought desperate defensive battles in Malaya and Singapore, where over 15,000 Australians became prisoners when Singapore fell in February 1942. Thousands died in Japanese prison camps or as slave laborers on projects like the Burma Railway. Australian forces fought in the brutal New Guinea campaign, stopping Japanese advance toward Port Moresby in jungle warfare that tested soldiers to their limits. The Kokoda Track campaign, fought in mountainous jungle terrain with limited supplies, became legendary in Australian military history. Australian forces also fought in Borneo, Bougainville, and throughout the Pacific. Australian industry converted to war production, building ships, aircraft, and munitions. Australian pilots flew with the RAF and RAAF in Europe and the Pacific. Over 1 million Australians served in uniform from a population of 7 million, and nearly 40,000 died. The war fundamentally changed Australia's strategic outlook, shifting from reliance on Britain to a closer alliance with the United States, recognizing that America, not Britain, had the power to defend Australia against Asian threats. New Zealand contributed forces far exceeding what might be expected from a nation of only 1.6 million people. Over 200,000 New Zealanders served in uniform, and nearly 12,000 died, one of the highest per capita death rates among Commonwealth nations. New Zealand forces, like their Australian counterparts, fought primarily under British command in Europe and North Africa rather than in the Pacific. The New Zealand Division fought with distinction in Greece, where Allied forces tried and failed to stop German invasion in 1941. New Zealand troops fought in the Battle of Crete, the first major airborne invasion in history where German paratroopers suffered heavy casualties but eventually captured the island. New Zealand forces were among the last to evacuate, maintaining discipline under desperate circumstances. In North Africa, New Zealand troops fought throughout the campaign, from the early battles against Italy to El Alamein and the final victory in Tunisia. The New Zealand Division developed a reputation for aggressive, skillful fighting. New Zealand forces fought in Italy, including the costly battles at Monte Cassino and throughout the Italian campaign. New Zealand pilots served in the RAF and New Zealand ships served in the Royal Navy. The Battle of the River Plate, one of the first major naval engagements, included the New Zealand cruiser Achilles helping to defeat the German pocket battleship Graf Spee. New Zealand's contribution to the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan saw thousands of aircrew trained in New Zealand's safer skies. New Zealand industry and agriculture supplied food, wool, and materials to Britain throughout the war. The war strengthened New Zealand's national identity while maintaining its close ties to Britain. Though, like Australia, New Zealand increasingly recognized the importance of the United States in Pacific security. British India contributed the largest volunteer army in history, over 2.5 million men, fighting for the British Empire despite India's colonial status. Indian troops fought in nearly every theater of the war. In North Africa, Indian divisions fought against Italian and German forces throughout the campaign. In Italy, Indian troops were crucial in breaking through German defensive lines and liberating Italian territory. The capture of Monte Cassino included significant contributions from Indian forces. In the Far East, Indian troops bore the brunt of Japanese attacks. When Japan invaded Malaya and Burma, Indian divisions fought delaying actions against superior Japanese forces. The Burma campaign fought in jungle and monsoon conditions, saw Indian troops playing central roles in the longest land campaign against Japan, the battles of Impol and Kohima in 1944, where British and Indian forces stopped Japanese invasion of India, were among the most desperate of the Pacific War. Indian troops fought with courage and skill despite often being poorly equipped and supplied. The British Indian Army was diverse, including Sikhs, Gurkhas, Muslims, Hindus, and others from across the subcontinent. This diversity sometimes created tensions but also demonstrated the vast human resources Britain could draw from its empire. However, the war accelerated Indian independence movements. Many Indians questioned why they should fight for British freedom while India remained colonized. The Indian National Army, formed by Subhas Chandra Bose from Indian prisoners captured by Japan, fought alongside Japan against the British, seeking to liberate India through Axis support. After the war, Britain, economically exhausted, could no longer hold India. Independence came in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, creating India and Pakistan in a partition that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The war that saw millions of Indians fight for the British Empire hastened the empire's end. Finland fought what it called the Winter War against the Soviet Union from November 1939 to March 1940. Defending its independence with spectacular success against overwhelming odds, Stalin demanded territorial concessions from Finland and, when refused, invaded with massive forces. The Soviet Union expected quick victory over tiny Finland, population 3.7 million facing the Soviet Union's population of nearly 200 million. But Finnish forces, fighting in brutal winter conditions they knew intimately, inflicted devastating casualties on Soviet forces. Finnish ski troops moved through forests, ambushing Soviet columns and disappearing. The tactic of Marty, surrounding and destroying Soviet units, was used repeatedly with great success. One Finnish sniper, Simo Hiei, nicknamed the White Death, is credited with over 500 kills. Soviet tanks were destroyed by Molotov cocktails, improvised incendiary weapons Finns named mockingly after Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. Despite heroic resistance, Finland couldn't resist indefinitely. The Winter War ended in March 1940 with Finland ceding territory but maintaining independence, a victory of sorts. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Finland joined the attack in what Finns call the Continuation War, seeking to reclaim lost territory and secure Finnish survival. Finnish forces advanced alongside Germans on the northern front, but notably refused to participate in the siege of Leningrad or to advance beyond their pre-Winter War borders. Finland walked a diplomatic tightrope, fighting alongside Germany without becoming a formal Axis member, preserving some independence while utilizing German support against the Soviet Union. In 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, Finland negotiated a separate armistice with the Soviet Union, agreeing to pay reparations and expel German forces from Finnish territory. This led to the Lapland War, where Finnish forces fought their former German allies in northern Finland, a bizarre end to Finland's complex war. Finland maintained independence but at a heavy cost, losing territory and accepting Soviet influence in its foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Romania entered World War II as a reluctant Axis ally, motivated primarily by the desire to recover territory seized by the Soviet Union in 1940. Romania's importance to the Axis war effort cannot be overstated. The Plokhty oil fields provided much of Germany's petroleum, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Without Romanian oil, German tanks, aircraft and trucks would have ground to a halt. In June 1940, Stalin forced Romania to cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Then Hungary, with German and Italian arbitration, took northern Transylvania. Bulgaria seized southern Dobruja. Romania lost over a third of its territory and population in 3 months without firing a shot. This humiliation led to the rise of Marshal Ion Antonescu, who allied Romania with Germany and joined the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Romanian forces participated in Operation Barbarossa, contributing the third largest Axis force after Germany and Italy. Romanian troops fought at Odessa, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, and throughout the Eastern Front. Over 500,000 Romanian soldiers died fighting the Soviet Union. Romanian treatment of Jews was horrific. The Antonescu regime murdered between 280,000 and 380,000 Romanian and Ukrainian Jews in territories under Romanian control. The Iochi pogrom in June 1941 saw Romanian soldiers and civilians massacre thousands of Jews in a single day. As the war turned against Germany, Romania's position became untenable. Soviet forces approached Romanian borders in 1944. On August 23, 1944, King Michael I staged a coup, arresting Antonescu and switching Romania to the Allied side. Romanian forces now fought against Germany and Hungary, contributing to the liberation of Transylvania and pushing into Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This switch probably shortened the war in Europe by months, as Romanian oil immediately stopped flowing to Germany and Romanian troops now fought against their former allies. However, Romania paid a heavy price. Soviet forces occupied the country, and Romania fell under communist control for the next 45 years. its wartime suffering replaced by decades of Soviet domination. Hungary followed a similar path to Romania, allying with Germany out of desire to recover lost territory and fear of Soviet expansion, then suffering catastrophic consequences. After World War I, the Treaty of Trianon stripped Hungary of two-thirds of its territory. Hungarian revisionism, the desire to recover these lands, drove much of Hungarian foreign policy. Hungary joined the Axis in 1940, and with German support, recovered territories from Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia in return. Hungary contributed forces to the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Hungarian Second Army fought on the Eastern Front, suffering devastating casualties at the Battle of Stalingrad and in subsequent Soviet offensives. Over 200,000 Hungarian soldiers died on the Eastern Front, losses Hungary could ill afford. Hungary's treatment of Jews was complex. Before German occupation in March 1944, Hungarian Jews faced discrimination but relative safety compared to Jews in Nazi-occupied territories. Hungarian Regent Admiral Horthy resisted German pressure to deport Jews. However, after German occupation, the situation changed catastrophically. Adolf Eichmann organized the deportation of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks, one of the Holocaust's fastest and most efficient killing operations. By late 1944, Hungary tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Soviets, but Germany occupied the country fully and installed a puppet regime under the fascist Aero Cross Party. Budapest became a battleground, with one of the war's longest and most destructive urban battles. The Siege of Budapest from December 1944 to February 1945 destroyed much of the city and killed over 80,000 civilians. Soviet forces liberated Hungary, but, as with Romania, liberation meant Soviet occupation and communist rule. Hungary's attempt to play the diplomatic game, recovering territory through German favor while trying to preserve some independence, ended in catastrophe, with hundreds of thousands dead and decades of communist dictatorship. Czechoslovakia was betrayed before the war even began and then suffered 6 years of brutal occupation. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 saw Britain and France force Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland to Germany in hopes of appeasing Hitler. Czechoslovakia, with a modern army and strong fortifications, was prepared to fight, but its allies abandoned it. Czech President Edvard Beneš later said, "We have been betrayed. Munich bought peace for a year while teaching Hitler that Western democracies wouldn't fight." In March 1939, Hitler broke his Munich promises and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under direct German control and a puppet Slovak state. Czech industry, particularly the Koda works, became a major source of German weapons. Czech workers produced tanks, aircraft and munitions for the Wehrmacht, though sabotage and work slowdowns were common. Czech resistance operated throughout the occupation, conducting intelligence gathering and sabotage. The most dramatic resistance action came in May 1942 when Czech agents trained in Britain assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi official governing Bohemia and Moravia and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. Operation Anthropoid saw agents ambush Heydrich's car in Prague, mortally wounding him. German reprisals were savage. The village of Lidis was razed, all men murdered, women sent to concentration camps, and children either killed or Germanized. Over 5,000 Czechs were arrested and 1,300 executed in the aftermath, despite the terrible cost. The assassination demonstrated that Czech resistance continued and that even high-ranking Nazis weren't safe. Czech pilots and soldiers who escaped before German occupation fought with Allied forces. Czech pilots flew in the Battle of Britain with distinction, and Czech units fought in the Soviet army and with Western allies. When Soviet forces liberated Czechoslovakia in 1945, hopes for restored independence were brief. Communist coup in 1948 brought Czechoslovakia under Soviet control. The nation that had been one of Europe's most democratic and prosperous before the war endured Nazi occupation followed by communist dictatorship, not regaining freedom until 1989. Greece provided one of World War II's most surprising stories when it defeated an Italian invasion and then mounted fierce resistance against German occupation. On October 28, 1940, Italian forces invaded Greece from Albania, expecting quick victory. Greek Prime Minister Metaxas responded to the Italian ultimatum with a single word, OHI, meaning no. Greek forces not only stopped the Italian invasion but counterattacked, driving deep into Albania and threatening to push Italy out completely. It was the first Allied land victory of the war and a humiliating defeat for Mussolini. Hitler, forced to rescue his Italian ally, invaded Greece in April 1941. Despite British and Commonwealth support, German forces quickly overwhelmed Greek defenses. The Battle for Crete in May 1941 saw the first major airborne invasion in history. German paratroopers suffered horrific casualties but eventually captured the island after intense fighting. Greek civilian resistance was immediate and fierce. Partisan groups operated throughout the mountains, conducting guerrilla warfare against German, Italian, and Bulgarian occupation forces. The Greek resistance was politically divided between communist and non-communist factions, tensions that would explode into civil war after liberation. German reprisals against Greek civilians were brutal. Entire villages were destroyed, thousands executed in retaliation for resistance activities. The Distomo massacre in June 1944 saw German troops murder over 200 civilians, including women and children. Greece suffered terrible famine during occupation, with over 300,000 civilians starving to death, partly due to German requisitions of food and partly from Allied blockade preventing food imports. Greek merchant sailors continued fighting with Allied forces, suffering one of the highest casualty rates of any merchant fleet. Greek resistance tied down Axis occupation forces and provided intelligence to allies. The successful deception operation that convinced Germans the Allied invasion would come at Greece rather than Sicily demonstrated Greek contribution to intelligence warfare. Greece emerged from the war devastated, with over 500,000 dead from a population of 7 million, facing immediate civil war that would claim another 150,000 lives before communist forces were finally defeated in 1949. Yugoslavia produced what many historians consider the most effective resistance movement in occupied Europe. When Germany invaded in April 1941, Yugoslav forces collapsed within 11 days. The country was dismembered, with Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria each taking territories, while Croatia became a puppet state under the fascist Ustashi regime. But Yugoslav resistance emerged almost immediately and it was divided. The Chetniks, royalist Serbian forces under Draka Mihailović, fought against the Axis but also against the communist partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, sometimes even collaborating with Axis forces against communists. Tito's partisans became the most significant resistance force in occupied Europe. At their peak, they fielded 800,000 fighters, tying down numerous German divisions that could have been used elsewhere. The partisans fought using guerrilla tactics in Yugoslavia's mountainous terrain, establishing zones of control and even creating a parallel government. They received Allied support, particularly after British intelligence concluded they were more effective than the Chetniks at fighting Germans. Winston Churchill decided to support Tito, despite his communism, prioritizing defeating Germany over post-war political considerations. The partisans fought 7 major German offensives designed to destroy them. Each time, they survived through mobility, mountain warfare expertise, and support from local populations. The Battle of Sjeska in 1943, where 20,000 partisans broke through German encirclement despite heavy casualties, demonstrated their resilience and fighting capability. Yugoslavia's war was not just resistance against occupation, but civil war among Yugoslav factions. The Ustashi regime in Croatia committed genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, murdering hundreds of thousands in concentration camps like Jasenovac. Serbian Chetniks massacred Muslims and Croats. Partisan forces executed collaborators and political enemies. The violence was brutal and multifaceted, creating wounds that would fester for decades. When German forces withdrew in 1944, partisan forces liberated Yugoslavia largely on their own, unique among occupied European nations. Tito emerged as undisputed leader, establishing communist Yugoslavia that would remain independent of Soviet control. Yugoslavia's resistance cost over 1 million lives but created a nation that briefly united diverse ethnic groups under communist rule before exploding into violence again in the 1990s. The Netherlands suffered 5 years of increasingly harsh German occupation that transformed a prosperous, neutral nation into one of the war's most devastated countries. The Netherlands declared neutrality in 1939. Hoping to avoid war as it had in World War I, but on May 10, 1940, Germany invaded without warning. Despite brave resistance, Dutch forces were overwhelmed in 5 days. The bombing of Rotterdam on May 14, which killed over 900 civilians and destroyed the city center, forced Dutch surrender to prevent further destruction. Queen Wilhelmina and the government escaped to Britain, continuing resistance from exile. German occupation began relatively mildly but grew progressively harsher. The Netherlands was considered a fellow Germanic nation by Nazis, and initially, Germans hoped for collaboration. Some Dutch did collaborate, joining the Waffen-SS Netherlands Legion, but resistance grew as occupation worsened. Dutch resistance operated underground networks that hid Allied pilots, conducted sabotage, gathered intelligence, and perhaps most famously, organized the hiding of Jews and others persecuted by Nazis. Anne Frank, hidden in Amsterdam for over 2 years before betrayal and death in Bergen-Belsen, became the face of Dutch Jewish suffering. Of the Netherlands' 140,000 Jews, over 100,000 were deported to death camps. Only about 30,000 survived, the highest percentage killed of any Western European country. The Dutch rail system was crucial for German military logistics, making it a prime target for sabotage. The Dutch railway strike in September 1944, called to support Operation Market Garden, paralyzed German transportation but resulted in German retaliation that caused the hunger winter of 1944-1945. German forces blocked food supplies to the Western Netherlands in retaliation for the strike and Allied advances. Over 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death during this final winter of occupation. Canadian forces liberated most of the Netherlands in 1945, fighting fierce battles through flooded polders and fortified positions. The liberation of the Netherlands remains one of Canada's proudest military achievements, and Dutch gratitude endures to this day. The Netherlands emerged from the war economically devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its Jewish population almost annihilated, but determined to rebuild and never again trust in neutrality for protection. Belgium became a battleground twice in 5 years. First in 1940 when German blitzkrieg bypassed the Maginot Line by attacking through Belgium, and again in 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Belgium had declared neutrality, but Germany invaded on May 10, 1940, the same day as the Netherlands. Belgian forces fought bravely, holding the fort at Ebony Mail until German glider troops used shaped charges to destroy the fortifications. King Leopold III controversially surrendered Belgian forces on May 28, remaining in Belgium under house arrest while his government fled to Britain. His decision to surrender and remain sparked debates about collaboration that continued long after the war. German occupation divided Belgium between military administration in the north and civil administration elsewhere. Belgium's location made it strategically vital, and its ports and transportation networks were essential to German operations. Belgian resistance organized networks that helped Allied pilots escape, gathered intelligence, and conducted sabotage. The Comet Line, one of the most successful escape routes, helped over 700 Allied aircrew evade capture and return to Britain. Belgian civilians suffered from food shortages, forced labor deportations, and German reprisals against resistance activities. Belgium's Jewish population of about 65,000 saw over 25,000 deported to death camps, though Belgium had one of the lower Jewish death rates in occupied Europe, partly due to widespread civilian efforts to hide Jews. In December 1944, Belgium became the center of Germany's last major offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge saw German forces attack through the Ardennes, creating a bulge in Allied lines and besieging the town of Bastogne. American forces, including the famous response nuts, when Germans demanded surrender, held Bastogne until relief arrived. The battle killed over 3,000 Belgian civilians caught in the fighting and destroyed numerous Belgian towns. Liberation came in September 1944 for most of Belgium, but the Battle of the Bulge showed that even in the war's final months, Belgium remained a battlefield. The country emerged devastated but rebuilt quickly, becoming a founding member of NATO and the European Economic Community, ensuring that Belgian soil would never again be so easily crossed by invading armies. Norway was invaded by Germany in April 1942, secured iron ore supplies from Sweden and naval bases for operations against Britain. Operation Weserübung, the German invasion, used airborne troops, parachutists, and amphibious assaults in a coordinated operation that shocked the world with its audacity. Norwegian forces and British troops rushed to help fought German forces in a 2-month campaign. The Battle of Narvik saw successful Allied operations that briefly recaptured the crucial port, but Germany's invasion of France forced Allied withdrawal, leaving Norway to German occupation. King Haakon VII and the government escaped to Britain, refusing German demands to legitimize occupation. Vidkun Quisling, whose name became synonymous with traitor, established a collaborationist regime, but most Norwegians rejected his authority. Norwegian resistance operated throughout occupation, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the famous heavy water raid. Vemork in Norway produced heavy water, essential for German nuclear research. Norwegian saboteurs trained in Britain and dropped into Norway, destroyed the heavy water facility in February 1943 in Operation Gunnerside, one of the most successful commando raids of the war. When Germans tried to ship remaining heavy water to Germany, Norwegian resistance sank the ferry carrying it. These operations may have delayed or prevented German development of atomic weapons. Norwegian Merchant Marine, one of the world's largest, served Allied cause throughout the war. Over half of Norway's merchant fleet was sunk, and over 4,000 Norwegian sailors died. The highest death rate of any branch of Norwegian service. Norwegian pilots and soldiers served with British and other Allied forces. Norwegian coastal waters saw continuous naval warfare, as British forces raided German shipping and installations while Germans used Norway as a base for attacks on Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union. The most famous Norwegian resistance fighter, Max Manus, conducted sabotage operations that sank numerous German ships in Oslo harbor. His story exemplifies Norwegian determination to resist despite overwhelming German presence. Liberation came in May 1945 when German forces in Norway surrendered. Norway emerged from the war with its merchant fleet devastated, coastal towns damaged by warfare, but national pride intact. Norwegian resistance demonstrated that even a small nation could meaningfully resist a powerful occupier through courage, ingenuity, and determination. Denmark surrendered to Germany within hours on April 9, 1940, when Germany invaded. The Danish government chose not to resist militarily, recognizing the impossibility of defending against overwhelming German force. This quick surrender spared Denmark the destruction other occupied countries suffered, but it also created moral ambiguities that haunted Denmark. Unlike other occupied nations, Denmark maintained its government and king throughout most of the occupation. operating under German oversight but retaining administrative control. This unique arrangement meant Denmark was neither fully occupied like Poland nor independent like neutral Sweden. The Danish government walked a tightrope, trying to maintain some sovereignty while accommodating German demands. Initially, this policy of cooperation meant relatively benign occupation. Danes kept their institutions, their economy functioned, and casualties were minimal. But as the war progressed and German demands increased, the arrangement became untenable. In August 1943, following increased resistance activity and German pressure, the Danish government resigned rather than impose German demands. Germany then imposed direct military rule. The most remarkable episode of Danish occupation was the rescue of Danish Jews in October 1943, when Germans planned to deport Denmark's approximately 8,000 Jews to death camps. Danish civilians organized a massive rescue operation. Within weeks, over 7,000 Jews were secretly transported to neutral Sweden in fishing boats, private vessels, and any craft available. The operation succeeded due to widespread Danish participation, from taxi drivers who transported Jews to doctors who sedated crying babies, and even German officials who deliberately looked the other way. Denmark had the lowest Jewish death rate of any occupied country, with over 95% surviving. This remains one of history's most successful rescue operations and demonstrates what determined civilian resistance can accomplish. Danish resistance grew more active as the war progressed, conducting sabotage against German military targets and collaborationist businesses. The Freedom Council coordinated resistance activities and functioned as an underground government. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Denmark was liberated with minimal fighting and began immediately pursuing collaborators. Thousands were tried and executed or imprisoned. As Denmark dealt with the moral complications of 5 years of cooperation and resistance, Denmark's experience shows the difficult choices occupied nations faced, and the possibility of successful non-violent resistance even under Nazi rule. Brazil was the only South American nation to send ground forces to fight in World War II, making a contribution often overlooked in English-language histories. Brazil initially maintained neutrality but had strong cultural and economic ties to both sides. Large German and Italian immigrant communities existed alongside traditional ties to Britain and France. The balance shifted when German U-boats began sinking Brazilian merchant ships in 1942. Over 30 Brazilian vessels were torpedoed, killing nearly 1,000 civilian sailors. Public outrage forced Brazil's hand. In August 1942, Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy. Brazil's contribution took time to mobilize, but by 1944, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, known by its Portuguese acronym FEB, deployed to Italy. Over 25,000 Brazilian troops fought alongside Allied forces in the Italian campaign. Brazilian soldiers, many from tropical climates, found themselves fighting in the mountains of northern Italy during winter, a harsh introduction to European warfare. The FEB fought in the difficult Italian terrain, participating in operations that broke through German defensive lines. Brazilian forces captured the strategic town of Montes in April 1945, one of their final significant actions. Over 450 Brazilian soldiers died in combat, with many more wounded. Brazilian participation was symbolically important, demonstrating hemispheric solidarity and contributing to final Allied victory in Italy. Brazil also allowed the United States to establish air and naval bases on its territory, particularly in the Northeast, which proved crucial for operations in the South Atlantic and for ferrying aircraft and supplies to Africa and beyond. Brazilian patrol aircraft and ships hunted German U-boats in the South Atlantic, protecting vital shipping lanes. Brazil's industrial contribution included supplying raw materials like rubber, minerals, and food to Allied war efforts. The war accelerated Brazilian industrialization and modernization, transforming the nation's economy and military. Brazilian veterans returned home with combat experience and new perspectives that influenced post-war Brazilian society and politics. Brazil's participation in World War II marked its emergence as a significant Latin American power and strengthened its relationship with the United States, a relationship that would shape Cold War alignments in South America. Mexico contributed to the Allied war effort through the Escuadrón Arlequín, a fighter squadron that fought in the Pacific Theater, and through vital support for the American war effort. Mexico had complex relations with the United States, including memories of territorial losses in the 19th century and American intervention in the Mexican Revolution. However, the threat of Axis powers and economic interests aligned Mexico with the Allies. Mexico declared war on the Axis powers in May 1942 after German U-boats sank Mexican oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexican-American relations improved dramatically during the war. The Bracero program allowed hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to enter the United States to fill labor shortages in agriculture and industry, supporting American war production. Mexico supplied oil, minerals, and other raw materials essential to the Allied war machine. The Escuadrón 201, Mexico's Air Force contribution. Trained in the United States and deployed to the Philippines in 1945. flying P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. Mexican pilots conducted ground attack missions supporting American operations in Luzon and Formosa. The squadron flew over 50 combat missions, demonstrating Mexican commitment to the Allied cause. 5 Mexican pilots died in training or combat. While Mexico's direct military contribution was modest compared to major powers, its support for the United States and contribution to hemispheric defense was significant. Mexican industry expanded during the war, and economic cooperation strengthened ties between the two nations. The war helped transform Mexico-United States relations from hostility to partnership, setting patterns that continued in the post-war era. Mexican participation in World War II is a source of national pride and demonstrated that even nations without major military power could contribute to defeating fascism. The war accelerated Mexican modernization and industrialization, transforming the nation's economy and strengthening its position in Latin America. South Africa contributed significantly to Allied victory despite internal divisions between English-speaking South Africans who generally supported the war and Afrikaner nationalists who opposed it or even sympathized with Nazi Germany. When Britain declared war in September 1939, South Africa's parliament narrowly voted to join the war, leading to the resignation of Prime Minister J.B.M. Hertzog and the formation of a pro-war government under Jan Smuts. South African forces fought primarily in Africa and the Mediterranean. In East Africa, South African troops participated in the campaign that liberated Ethiopia from Italian occupation. In North Africa, South African forces fought at the crucial Battle of El Alamein and throughout the Desert Campaign. The 1st South African Infantry Division fought in Egypt and Libya. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942 saw over 10,000 South African soldiers captured, one of South Africa's worst military defeats. South African pilots flew in the Battle of Britain and throughout the air war. The South African Air Force operated in East Africa, North Africa, Italy, and the Balkans, flying thousands of missions and suffering significant casualties. South African forces participated in the Italian campaign, fighting through difficult terrain against determined German resistance. The capture of Monte Sol and other positions demonstrated South African combat effectiveness. At sea, South African naval forces and merchant marine participated in convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. Over 340,000 South Africans served in uniform during the war, including some black, colored, and Indian South Africans. Though racist policies limited their roles primarily to non-combat positions, a bitter irony for a war fought partially against racist ideology. Over 12,000 South Africans died in service. South Africa's industrial contribution included manufacturing munitions, equipment, and supplies for Allied forces. The war strengthened ties between South Africa and Britain while deepening internal divisions that would shape post-war South African politics. The participation of non-white South Africans in the war effort, despite discrimination, contributed to later anti-apartheid movements, as veterans questioned why they had fought for freedom abroad while denied rights at home. Egypt occupied a unique position in World War II, officially neutral but British-controlled and site of some of the war's most crucial battles. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to its empire in Asia, ran through Egypt, making Egyptian territory strategically vital. Britain maintained large military forces in Egypt despite formal Egyptian sovereignty. When Italy declared war in 1940 and Italian forces in Libya threatened Egypt, the Western Desert became a major theater of war. Egyptian territory hosted the massive British military presence that fought the North Africa campaign. Cairo became the regional headquarters for Allied operations. Alexandria served as a major naval base. The Battle of El Alamein, fought in October-November 1942, just 60 miles from Alexandria, marked the turning point of the North African campaign. British Commonwealth forces under Montgomery defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps, saving Egypt from Axis occupation and beginning the long push that would clear North Africa of Axis forces. Egyptians lived with war on their doorstep. German and Italian aircraft bombed Egyptian cities. The war disrupted the economy, caused inflation and shortages, and brought hundreds of thousands of foreign troops onto Egyptian soil. The British military presence was resented by many Egyptians who sought independence. Pro-Axis sentiment existed among some Egyptian nationalists who saw Britain as the immediate oppressor rather than distant Germany. In February 1942, when Egypt's government appeared ready to appoint a pro-Axis prime minister, British forces surrounded the royal palace with tanks and forced the king to appoint a pro-British government. This humiliation deepened Egyptian resentment and undermined the monarchy's legitimacy. Egypt officially declared war on the Axis in February 1945, when the war was nearly over, primarily to secure a seat at the United Nations Founding Conference. Egyptian forces played no significant combat role, but Egyptian territory, facilities, and labor were essential to Allied operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The war accelerated Egyptian nationalism and anti-British sentiment. The humiliation of 1942, the presence of foreign troops, and post-war economic problems contributed to the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. that overthrew the monarchy and established the Republic under Gamal Abdel Nasser. World War II weakened British control over Egypt and the Middle East, contributing to the end of European colonialism in the region. Ethiopia holds the distinction of being one of the first nations to fight against Axis aggression and one of the symbols of resistance to fascism. Italy invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, using modern weapons including poison gas against Ethiopian forces armed primarily with rifles and spears. Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations for help, warning that Ethiopia's fate would be the world's fate, a prophetic statement ignored by the international community. Italy conquered Ethiopia by May 1936, forcing Haile Selassie into exile. The occupation was brutal, with Italian forces committing massacres against civilians and using concentration camps. Ethiopian resistance never ceased. Guerrilla fighters, called Abegnok, operated throughout the country, making Italian control tenuous outside major cities. When World War II began, Ethiopia became a theater of the East African Campaign. British Commonwealth and Free French forces, along with Ethiopian resistance fighters, liberated Ethiopia from Italian occupation in 1941. Haile Selassie returned in triumph, one of the few monarchs to regain his throne after Axis conquest. Ethiopian irregular forces played crucial roles in the liberation, knowing the terrain and enjoying popular support. The campaign demonstrated that fascist conquest could be reversed and inspired resistance movements elsewhere. Ethiopia's liberation was more than military victory, it was symbolic triumph over fascism and colonialism. Ethiopia had maintained independence through the scramble for Africa, been conquered by fascism and regained freedom. Haile Selassie became an international figure representing African dignity and resistance. Ethiopia's experience in World War II shaped its post-war role as a leader in African independence movements and Pan-Africanism. The war cost thousands of Ethiopian lives but restored sovereignty and demonstrated Ethiopian resilience. Ethiopia's flag flew at the United Nations Founding Conference, representing African participation in the New World Order emerging from the war. Iran found itself occupied by Allied forces, despite officially neutral status, its territory and oil resources too valuable to leave in potentially hostile hands. The Shah Reza Pahlavi maintained friendly relations with Germany, causing Allied concern as war spread. Iran's oil fields and its position between the Soviet Union and British-controlled Iraq made it strategically vital. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran simultaneously in Operation Countenance, overthrowing resistance within days. The Shah, seen as pro-German, was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Iran was divided into occupation zones, with British forces in the south and Soviets in the north, while the Iranian government retained nominal sovereignty. The Persian Corridor became one of the most important supply routes of the war. Millions of tons of American Lend-Lease supplies flowed through Iran to the Soviet Union, including trucks, aircraft, food, and equipment. This southern supply route was safer than Arctic convoys, which faced German U-boats and aircraft. Iranian labor and infrastructure were pressed into Allied service. Ports, roads, and railways were upgraded to handle the massive supply flow. Tens of thousands of Iranian workers supported Allied logistics operations. The Allied occupation brought economic disruption, inflation, and food shortages that caused hardship for ordinary Iranians. The presence of foreign troops on Iranian soil, while not as brutal as Axis occupations elsewhere, rankled Iranian nationalism. The Tehran Conference in November 1943 brought together Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in the Iranian capital to coordinate Allied strategy. This meeting, where the Big Three planned the final defeat of Germany, demonstrated Iran's strategic importance. The conference also produced the Tehran Declaration, promising to maintain Iranian independence and territorial integrity after the war. However, Soviet forces were slow to withdraw after war's end, leading to the first Cold War crisis in 1946. Iran's experience in World War II demonstrated how strategic location and resources could override neutrality. The war accelerated Iranian modernization, strengthened ties with the United States, and contributed to Iranian nationalism that would shape the country's turbulent post-war history. Iranian oil continued flowing to Allied forces throughout the war, fueling vehicles and aircraft that defeated the Axis. Iraq experienced a brief but significant pro-Axis coup in 1941 that threatened Allied oil supplies and required British military intervention. Iraq had gained independence from Britain in 1932 but remained under heavy British influence, particularly regarding oil fields and military bases. In April 1941, nationalist military officers led by Rashid Aliya Gilani seized power in a coup, seeking to reduce British influence and hoping for Axis support. The new government demanded British forces leave Iraq and sought assistance from Germany. Hitler, focused on preparations for invading the Soviet Union, provided limited support, sending aircraft to bases in Vichy-controlled Syria. Britain responded with military force. British and Commonwealth forces, including the Arab Legion from Transjordan and Indian Army units, invaded Iraq from multiple directions. The Anglo-Iraqi War lasted just 1 month. From May 2 to May 31, 1941, Iraqi forces, poorly equipped and lacking German support beyond a few aircraft, were defeated. British forces besieged and captured Baghdad. Rashid Ali and his supporters fled, and a pro-British government was restored. The brief conflict secured British control of Iraqi oil, essential for the war effort, and prevented Iraq from becoming an Axis ally that could threaten British positions in the Middle East. Iraq officially declared war on the Axis in January 1943, joining the Allies, though Iraqi forces played no significant combat role. Iraqi oil continued flowing to Allied forces throughout the war. The country hosted Allied military bases and served as part of the supply route to the Soviet Union. The 1941 coup and its suppression had lasting effects on Iraqi politics. British intervention was resented by Iraqi nationalists. The restored monarchy, seen as a British puppet, lost legitimacy. Seeds were planted for the eventual 1958 revolution that overthrew the monarchy and established the republic. The Farhad, a violent pogrom against Baghdad's Jewish community in June 1941 following the coup's collapse, killed nearly 200 Jews and marked the beginning of the end for Iraq's ancient Jewish community, most of whom would eventually flee to Israel. Iraq's brief flirtation with the Axis demonstrated the Middle East's strategic importance and the fragility of colonial arrangements that would collapse in the post-war era. Turkey maintained precarious neutrality throughout most of World War II, playing Germany and the Allies against each other while trying to preserve Turkish independence and territorial integrity. Turkey's position controlling the straits between the Black Sea and Mediterranean gave it strategic importance that both sides recognized. Turkish leader İsmet İnönü unconducted masterful diplomatic balancing, extracting benefits from both sides while committing to neither. Turkey signed a mutual assistance pact with Britain and France in 1939, but didn't enter the war when Germany invaded Poland. Turkey maintained trade with Germany, providing chrome and other materials essential to German war industry, while also trading with Britain. Both sides pressured Turkey to join their cause or at least cut off the other side's supplies. German military success in 1940 to 1941 pushed Turkey toward Germany. The fall of France, German control of the Balkans, and German advances in the Soviet Union made Axis victory seem likely. Turkey signed a friendship treaty with Germany in 1941, though it didn't join the war. As the tide turned against Germany, Turkey gradually shifted toward the Allies. The German defeat at Stalingrad and Allied victories in North Africa convinced Turkish leaders that Germany would lose. Turkey began reducing trade with Germany and increasing cooperation with the Allies. In August 1944, Turkey broke relations with Germany. Finally, in February 1945, with Germany's defeat, certain Turkey declared war on Germany and Japan, primarily to secure a seat at the United Nations Founding Conference. Turkish forces never engaged in combat. Turkey's neutrality served Turkish interests remarkably well. The country avoided the devastation that destroyed so many European and Asian nations. Turkish territory wasn't invaded or bombed. The economy benefited from selling supplies to both sides at inflated wartime prices. Turkey maintained independence and territorial integrity, avoiding the fate of nations that chose the losing side. However, Turkish neutrality had moral ambiguities. Turkey provided Germany with materials that supported the Nazi war. While knowing about the Holocaust and Germany's brutal occupation policies, Turkey refused to take strong action against German espionage and sabotage operations conducted from Turkish territory against Allied targets. Turkish policy reflected cold calculation of national interest over moral considerations, a choice many neutral nations made. After the war, Turkey aligned firmly with the West, joining NATO in 1952 and becoming a key Cold War ally against the Soviet Union. Spain officially remained neutral throughout World War II, but its neutrality heavily favored the Axis, and thousands of Spanish volunteers fought for Germany on the Eastern Front. Spain's civil war had just ended in 1939 with Francisco Franco's nationalist victory, achieved with massive Italian and German support. Franco's government had received support from Axis countries during his rise, creating a close relationship between them. Although Spain stayed officially neutral when World War II began, Franco met with German leaders in Hendaye in October 1942 to discuss whether Spain might take part in the conflict. One of Germany's goals was to encourage Spain to move against Gibraltar, the key British stronghold at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Franco demanded extensive territorial concessions in French North Africa, massive military and economic aid, and guarantees of Spanish colonial holdings. The demands were so excessive and Franco's military so weak after the Civil War that Hitler left the meeting frustrated, reportedly saying he would rather have several teeth pulled than negotiate with Franco again. Spain never formally joined the Axis, but Spanish assistance was substantial. División Azul, or Blue Division, consisting of Spanish volunteers, fought alongside German forces on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1943. Nearly 50,000 Spanish soldiers served in the division at various times, fighting at the Siege of Leningrad and other battles. Nearly 5,000 died fighting communism alongside Nazis. Spanish ports provided supplies and repairs to German submarines. Spanish intelligence services cooperated with German espionage. Spanish tungsten, essential for hardening steel and weapons production, was sold to Germany throughout most of the war. Spain also helped thousands of Jews and Allied servicemen escape across Spain to safety, providing transit for refugees and downed pilots making their way to Gibraltar or Portugal. This humanitarian assistance contradicted Spain's pro-Axis stance and may have helped Spain's post-war rehabilitation. As Allied victory became clear, Spain shifted toward neutrality. In fact, rather than just name, the Blue Division was withdrawn in 1943 after Allied pressure. Trade with Germany decreased while trade with the Allies increased. By 1944, Spain was cooperating with Allied intelligence and limiting assistance to Germany. Franco's Spain survived the war intact, the only fascist regime in Europe to do so. Though it faced international isolation in the immediate post-war years, Spain wasn't allowed to join the United Nations until 1955 and remained a pariah state until Cold War considerations made Franco's anti-communism valuable to the West. Spain's official neutrality masked significant support for the Axis that only shifted when German defeat became certain. Portugal maintained careful neutrality under dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, balancing between its ancient alliance with Britain and economic pressures from Germany. Portugal's neutrality was more genuinely neutral than Spain's. Though Portuguese tungsten exports to Germany aided the Nazi war effort, Portugal's geographic position gave it strategic importance. The Azores Islands in the Atlantic were crucial for air and naval operations. German submarines and Allied convoys both operated in Portuguese waters. Lisbon became Europe's most important neutral city, a hub of espionage where agents from all sides operated openly. Allied and Axis intelligence services ran operations from Portuguese soil, spying on each other while Portuguese authorities maintained official ignorance. Refugees flooded into Portugal, seeking ships to escape Nazi-occupied Europe. Tens of thousands of Jews, political dissidents, and others passed through Portugal on their way to safety. Some Portuguese diplomats, notably Aristides de Sousa Mendes, defied government orders and issued visas to thousands of refugees, saving many Jewish lives at the cost of their own careers. Portugal sold goods to both sides, profiting from wartime demand. Tungsten, essential for weapons production, was Portugal's most valuable export. Both Germany and the Allies competed for Portuguese tungsten, driving prices sky-high. Portugal became wealthy from this trade, though it meant supporting both sides simultaneously. The British alliance proved stronger than German economic pressure. In 1943, Portugal allowed Britain to establish air and naval bases in the Azores, providing crucial support for anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. This violated neutrality in Germany's favor but reflected Portugal's calculation that Allied victory was likely. Portuguese colonies in Africa provided resources and strategic positions. Mozambique and Angola bordered territories involved in the war, though fighting never reached Portuguese Africa. The colonies were used for smuggling and intelligence operations by both sides. Portugal's neutrality survived the war intact. The country wasn't invaded, its territory wasn't bombed, and its economy benefited from wartime trade. Salazar's dictatorship continued until 1968, and Portugal remained neutral throughout the Cold War as well. However, Portugal's wartime trade with Nazi Germany, including accepting Nazi gold looted from conquered nations and Holocaust victims, created controversies that emerged decades later. Portugal walked a fine line between its British alliance and its economic interests with Germany, maintaining neutrality while subtly favoring the Allies enough to survive the post-war reckoning that punished Axis collaborators. Austria occupied a unique and uncomfortable position in World War II, simultaneously victim and perpetrator, annexed by Nazi Germany yet contributing significantly to Nazi war efforts. The Anschluss of March 1938 saw German forces march into Austria to enthusiastic welcome from many Austrians. Hitler, himself Austrian-born, achieved his dream of uniting German-speaking peoples. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation, becoming Ostmark, the eastern province of Greater Germany. In Austria, a significant number of people supported the rise of the German-led movement. Austrian members of the movement had previously attempted a coup in 1934, during which Chancellor Dollfuss was killed. When the annexation occurred, large crowds gathered in Vienna to welcome the arrival of German leadership. Austrians served in the German military throughout the war, comprising a significant portion of Wehrmacht and SS forces. Some of the Nazi regime's worst perpetrators were Austrian. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, was Austrian. Many concentration camp commandants and guards were Austrian. Austrians participated in atrocities across occupied Europe. Vienna's Jewish community, over 200,000 before the war, was decimated. After the Anschluss, persecution of Jews intensified immediately. Kristallnacht in November 1938 saw synagogues burned and Jewish businesses destroyed throughout Austria. Nearly all Austrian Jews who didn't escape were murdered in the Holocaust. Mauthausen concentration camp, located in Austria, murdered over 100,000 prisoners. However, Austria also had opponents of Nazism. Austrian resistance groups operated throughout the war, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and helping Allied prisoners escape. The O5 resistance organization coordinated anti-Nazi activities across Austria. Austrians served in Allied forces, particularly in American and British units. After the war, Austria claimed victim status, arguing it had been Germany's first conquest. The Moscow Declaration of 1943 by Allied powers stated that Austria was the first victim of Nazi aggression. This interpretation, while convenient for post-war Austria, overlooked extensive Austrian participation in Nazi crimes. Austria emerged from the war occupied by the four Allied powers like Germany, but regained independence in 1955 through the Austrian State Treaty, which required Austrian neutrality. The country was rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid and prospered, but Austria's complex role in World War II, as both victim of annexation and willing participant in Nazi crimes, wasn't seriously confronted until decades later. The myth of Austria as purely victim rather than perpetrator shaped post-war Austrian identity and delayed reckoning with the nation's Nazi past. Philippines suffered brutal Japanese occupation and fought one of the Pacific War's longest resistance campaigns. As an American Commonwealth scheduled for independence in 1946, the Philippines was a prime Japanese target. Japan attacked the Philippines hours after Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. Despite warnings, American and Filipino forces were caught unprepared. Japanese forces landed on Luzon and quickly advanced toward Manila. American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island for 4 months. They held out under desperate conditions, with supplies running low and no hope of reinforcement. MacArthur was ordered to Australia, leaving with his famous promise, "I shall return." The defenders of Bataan surrendered in April 1942, and Corregidor fell in May. The Bataan Death March followed, where Japanese forces marched over 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners 65 miles in tropical heat with minimal food or water. Thousands died from exhaustion, disease, and Japanese brutality. Prisoners who couldn't keep up were beaten or executed. It remains one of the war's worst atrocities. Japanese occupation was brutal. Over 100,000 Filipinos died from war-related causes. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was destroyed in fighting during liberation, with over 100,000 civilians killed in the Battle of Manila in 1945, many murdered deliberately by Japanese forces. Filipino resistance never ceased. Guerrilla forces operated throughout the islands, conducting ambushes, intelligence gathering, and sabotage. The resistance tied down significant Japanese forces and provided crucial intelligence to American forces planning return. Various guerrilla groups, some communist, some nationalist, some led by former military officers, operated independently but united in opposing Japan. MacArthur returned in October 1944, landing at Leyte and beginning the liberation campaign. Filipino guerrillas supported American operations, with some areas already liberated by guerrillas before American forces arrived. The fighting to liberate the Philippines lasted until Japan's surrender in August 1945, with some Japanese units holding out in mountains even after surrender. The Philippines emerged from the war devastated. Cities destroyed, economy ruined, over 1 million dead, and deep scars from occupation and resistance. Independence came in 1946 as promised, though the country faced communist insurgency rooted in wartime resistance movements. Philippine experience in World War II shaped the nation's identity and its relationship with both the United States and Japan. The war's legacy, including collaboration, resistance, and suffering, continues influencing Philippine politics and culture. Burma became one of World War II's most grueling battlegrounds, where Allied forces fought through jungle, mountain, and monsoon to stop Japanese expansion and reopen supply routes to China. Burma's strategic importance lay in the Burma Road, the supply route connecting British-controlled Burma to China. Japan invaded Burma in January 1942, quickly overwhelming outnumbered British, Indian, and Burmese defenders. By May 1942, Allied forces had retreated into India, and Japan controlled Burma. The retreat through Burma was a military disaster, with thousands dying from disease, starvation, and combat. The fall of Burma cut China's last land supply route, leaving only dangerous aerial supply over the Himalayas, the Hump, as it was called. Chinese forces in Burma fought alongside British and Indian troops, but coordination was difficult and defeat was inevitable. Japanese occupation promised Burmese independence from British colonialism, and some Burmese nationalists, including Aung San, initially collaborated with Japan. The Burma Independence Army fought alongside Japanese forces against the British. However, Japanese brutality and exploitation quickly turned most Burmese against occupation. The campaign to retake Burma was one of the war's longest and most difficult. Fighting continued from 1942 to 1945 in some of the world's worst terrain and climate. The monsoon season turned roads into rivers of mud. Jungle diseases killed more men than combat. Supply was nightmarish, with everything having to be flown in or carried through trackless mountains. Special forces operated behind Japanese lines. The Chindits, British long-range penetration forces led by Orde Wingate, conducted deep raids into Japanese-held territory, supplied entirely by air. American forces under General Joseph Stilwell worked to reopen land routes to China, building the Lado Road through impossible terrain. Chinese forces, trained and equipped by Americans, fought alongside British and Indian forces. The battles of Impul and Kohima in 1944 stopped Japanese invasion of India and marked the turning point. Over 60,000 Japanese soldiers died in these battles, many from starvation and disease as supply lines collapsed. The Japanese offensive was the most devastating Japanese defeat until that point. Allied forces, primarily British, Indian, and African units, pushed back through Burma in 1945, liberating Rangoon in May. Burmese resistance, now turned against Japan, aided Allied advance. The Burma campaign demonstrated the difficulties of jungle warfare and the courage of soldiers fighting in impossible conditions. Indian Army forces bore the brunt of the fighting, with over 100,000 Indian casualties. African troops from East and West Africa fought with distinction in Burma's jungles. The campaign is sometimes called the Forgotten War because it received less attention than European and Pacific theaters, but the soldiers who fought there knew its importance and cost. Thailand took the unique path of allying with Japan while maintaining some independence, the only Southeast Asian nation to avoid direct colonial occupation. When Japan demanded passage through Thailand to attack Malaya and Burma in December 1941, Thai leaders faced an impossible choice: resist and be destroyed, or cooperate and survive. Thailand chose cooperation. After brief resistance that killed several hundred Thai soldiers, Thailand signed an alliance with Japan. Thai ports and air bases supported Japanese operations throughout Southeast Asia. Thai forces nominally fought alongside Japan, though Thai units saw limited combat. Thailand declared war on the United States and Britain in January 1942, a declaration that reflected Japanese pressure more than Thai desires. However, the Thai ambassador to the United States, Seni Pramoj, refused to deliver the declaration, arguing he represented the Thai people, not the military government coerced by Japan. This technicality proved crucial after the war. Within Thailand, a resistance movement called the Free Thai operated throughout the war. Led by Prithipa Namyong, the regent who opposed the alliance with Japan, the Free Thai conducted intelligence operations for the Allies, helped Allied prisoners escape, and prepared for eventual liberation. The Free Thai coordinated with American OSS and British intelligence, providing valuable information about Japanese forces in Southeast Asia. Thailand's collaboration with Japan was pragmatic rather than ideological. Thai leaders used Japanese alliance to regain territories lost to British and French colonial powers, temporarily annexing parts of Burma, Malaya, Laos, and Cambodia. But Japanese occupation, while not as brutal as in other countries, still brought hardship. Japanese military requisitions caused food shortages. Thai laborers were forced to work on projects like the Burma Railway. As Allied victory became apparent, Thailand positioned itself for post-war survival. The Free Thai resistance demonstrated that Thailand had opposed Japan internally even while cooperating externally. When Japan surrendered, Thailand's government fell and a new government sought accommodation with the Allies because the United States had never formally accepted Thailand's declaration of war. And because of Free Thai cooperation, Thailand was treated more leniently than other Japanese allies. Britain demanded territorial concessions and reparations, but American pressure ensured Thailand maintained independence and territorial integrity. Thailand emerged from the war intact, having navigated impossible circumstances through pragmatic cooperation and covert resistance. The country became a strong American ally during the Cold War, hosting American bases for operations in Vietnam. Thailand's path through World War II demonstrated the difficult choices small nations faced when caught between great powers. Malaya was a British colony, rich in rubber and tin, resources essential to modern warfare, making it a prime Japanese target. Japan invaded Malaya on December 8, 1941, landing forces on the northeastern coast and advancing rapidly down the peninsula. British forces, including British, Indian, and Australian troops, fought a fighting retreat. Unable to stop Japanese advance through jungle that British commanders had considered impassable to modern armies, Japanese forces used bicycles to move quickly through jungle paths, advancing faster than defenders could retreat. Japanese air superiority, achieved when Japanese aircraft destroyed British air power in opening attacks, gave Japanese forces freedom to attack at will. The sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse by Japanese aircraft on December 10, 1941, was a devastating blow to British naval power and prestige. In 70 days, Japanese forces conquered the entire Malay Peninsula, culminating in the fall of Singapore in February 1942. The surrender of Singapore, where over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a smaller Japanese force, was described by Churchill as the worst disaster in British military history. Japanese occupation of Malaya was brutal. The Sukching massacre in Singapore saw Japanese forces systematically murder thousands of ethnic Chinese suspected of opposing Japan. Throughout Malaya, Japanese military police terrorized the population. Food became scarce as the economy collapsed and Japanese requisitions stripped the country. Resistance emerged, primarily from the Malayan Communist Party and ethnic Chinese guerrillas who received British support. The Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army operated from jungle bases, conducting sabotage and ambushes. British special operations, including Force 136, worked with guerrillas and prepared for eventual liberation. The ethnic divisions in Malaya complicated both occupation and resistance. The Japanese cultivated some Malay nationalism, presenting themselves as liberators from British colonialism. Some Malays collaborated, while ethnic Chinese and Indians generally opposed Japanese rule. These divisions would later fuel the Malayan Emergency, the communist insurgency that erupted after the war. Liberation came in September 1945 after Japan's surrender. British forces returned to reclaim their colony, but the war had shattered British prestige. The ease of Japanese conquest and 3 years of occupation weakened British colonial authority. The resistance fighters who had fought Japan weren't willing to simply accept British colonial rule's restoration. The seeds of Malayan independence were planted during Japanese occupation. Malaya gained independence in 1957, becoming Malaysia. The Japanese occupation, brief but brutal, accelerated the end of British colonialism and shaped the new nation's ethnic politics. Singapore was Britain's Gibraltar of the East, a supposedly impregnable fortress that fell to Japan in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Singapore's defenses were built to resist naval attack from the sea. Its massive coastal guns pointed toward the ocean, reflecting British assumption that any attack would come by sea. But Japan attacked through Malaya from the north, the direction considered impossible for modern armies to traverse. When Japanese forces reached Singapore Island in early February 1942, they were actually outnumbered by defenders, but they held crucial advantages. Japanese forces had air superiority, having destroyed British air power in opening days of the campaign. They had momentum, having conquered Malaya in just 2 months, and they faced defenders who were demoralized, poorly led, and unprepared for Japanese tactics. The battle for Singapore lasted about a week. Japanese forces crossed the Strait of Johor, landing on Singapore's northwestern coast. British defenses crumbled rapidly. Water supplies were threatened. Civilian areas were bombed and shelled. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered unconditionally to Japanese General Yamashita. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops became prisoners. Japanese forces, numbering around 30,000, had captured a force nearly 3 times their size. The fall of Singapore shattered British colonial prestige throughout Asia. The myth of European invincibility was destroyed. Asian nationalism, seeing Europeans defeated by Asians, gained tremendous momentum. Japanese occupation of Singapore lasted 3.5 years. The immediate aftermath saw the Suk Ching massacre, where Japanese forces systematically killed ethnic Chinese civilians suspected of opposing Japan. Estimates range from 5,000 to 50,000 killed in this operation. Japanese occupation renamed Singapore Saigon II, Light of the South. The city became a major Japanese military base. Food shortages, disease, and Japanese military discipline made life harsh for civilians. Allied prisoners of war, including those who surrendered at Singapore, were used as slave labor on projects like the Burma Railway, where thousands died. Singapore was never liberated by military action. Japan surrendered in August 1945, and British forces returned to reclaim their colony in September. But British authority had been irreparably damaged. Singapore's path to independence began during Japanese occupation, with full independence achieved in 1965. The fall of Singapore demonstrated that European colonial powers were not invincible and accelerated the end of European colonialism throughout Asia. Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, was one of Japan's primary targets due to its oil, rubber, and strategic location. The colony provided crucial resources to the Japanese war machine and demonstrated the end of European colonialism in Asia. Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies in January 1942, landing forces across the vast archipelago. Dutch forces, supplemented by British, Australian, and American units, fought desperately but were overwhelmed. The Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, saw the Allied naval force destroyed trying to stop Japanese invasion convoys. By March 1942, all of the Dutch East Indies had fallen to Japan. Over 40,000 Dutch and Allied soldiers became prisoners, joining tens of thousands of civilians in internment camps. Japanese occupation lasted 3.5 years and was characterized by brutal exploitation. Indonesian laborers were forced to work on military projects throughout the Japanese Empire. The infamous Burma Railway used Indonesian forced labor alongside Allied prisoners. Tens of thousands died from overwork, disease, and starvation. The Ramusha system of forced labor sent hundreds of thousands of Indonesians to work sites across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Many never returned. Food production was disrupted, causing famine that killed over 2 million Indonesians. Japanese military requisitions stripped the islands of resources. The economy collapsed. Disease spread unchecked. Yet Japanese occupation also had unintended consequences. Japan promoted Indonesian nationalism, promising independence and allowing Indonesian leaders like Sukarno to organize politically. The Japanese trained Indonesian military units, giving Indonesians military experience they would use in fighting for independence after the war. The Indonesian language was promoted over Dutch. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Indonesian nationalists immediately declared independence rather than accepting the return of Dutch colonial rule. The Netherlands tried to reclaim their colony, but for years of warfare proved futile. In 1949, the Netherlands recognized Indonesian independence. World War II had destroyed Dutch colonial power and enabled Indonesian independence. The cost was enormous, with over 4 million Indonesians dying during the occupation from forced labor, famine, and violence. But Japanese occupation had shattered Dutch authority and given Indonesians the means and will to resist colonialism's return. Indonesia emerged from the war as an independent nation, though it faced decades of political instability, authoritarian rule, and ethnic conflicts that continue to this day. Vietnam, then French Indochina, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, experienced a complex occupation that saw Japanese control with French Vichy administration continuing until 1945. After France fell in 1940, Japan pressured the Vichy French administration in Indochina to allow Japanese military access. French colonial officials, with no realistic hope of resistance, complied. From 1940 to 1945, Japanese forces occupied Indochina while French colonial administration continued functioning under Japanese oversight. This unusual arrangement allowed Japan to use Indochina as a base for operations against China and Southeast Asia, while France maintained the fiction of colonial control. Vietnamese experience under this dual occupation was harsh. Both Japanese and French authorities exploited Vietnamese resources and labor. Agricultural production was shifted from rice to other crops for Japanese war needs, causing catastrophic famine in 1944-1945. Over 1 million Vietnamese starved to death in the northern regions. Japanese and French forces both suppressed Vietnamese nationalism, though Vietnamese resistance movements grew throughout the war. The most significant resistance came from the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and organized by the Indochinese Communist Party. The Viet Minh fought against both Japanese and French, receiving support from American OS and Chinese forces. In March 1945, with Allied victory imminent, Japan dissolved the French colonial administration and imprisoned French officials and military personnel. Japan granted nominal independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, installing puppet governments. This brief period of Japanese-sponsored independence lasted only until Japan's surrender in August. When Japan surrendered, the Viet Minh quickly seized power, declaring the Democratic Republic of Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh as president. France attempted to reclaim its colony, leading to the First Indochina War that lasted until 1954 and the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam, setting the stage for American involvement and the Vietnam War. World War II destroyed French colonial authority in Indochina. The ease of Japanese takeover, the famine caused by occupation policies, and the brief taste of independence all contributed to Vietnamese determination to resist French return. The wartime resistance led by the Viet Minh provided organization, experience, and leadership for the independence struggle that followed. Vietnam's experience in World War II was a crucial step on the path to independence, though that independence would only come after decades more of warfare. Korea suffered brutal Japanese occupation that began in 1910, long before World War II, but the war years saw intensified exploitation and cultural suppression. Korea, annexed by Japan, was considered part of the Japanese Empire. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, speak Japanese, and worship at Shinto shrines. The Korean language was suppressed in schools and public life. Japan attempted to erase Korean culture and identity, creating resentment that burns to this day. During World War II, Korea served as a source of labor and resources for the Japanese war machine. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans were conscripted for forced labor in mines, factories, and construction projects throughout the Japanese Empire. Tens of thousands died in these conditions. Korean men were conscripted into the Japanese military, forced to fight for the empire that oppressed them. Some served as guards in prisoner of war camps, where they earned reputations for brutality, though they were following Japanese orders. The comfort women system saw thousands of Korean women forced into sexual slavery for Japanese military. These women, euphemistically called comfort women, were sent to military brothels throughout Asia. Their suffering remained hidden for decades after the war, only emerging publicly in the 1990s. Japan's systematic exploitation and attempts to destroy Korean culture created deep hatred that influences Korean-Japanese relations to this day. Korean resistance continued throughout occupation. The Korean Provisional Government, based in China, organized resistance activities and worked with Allied forces. Korean guerrillas operated in Manchuria and China. Kim Il-sung, future leader of North Korea, fought with Soviet and Chinese forces against Japan. Korean independence activists lobbied Allied powers to recognize Korean independence after the war. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Koreans celebrated liberation. But their joy was short-lived. The Soviet Union occupied northern Korea while American forces occupied the south, a temporary division that became permanent. The Cold War transformed the division into two separate nations, North and South Korea. Leading to the Korean War in 1950, Korea's experience under Japanese occupation was one of the war's great tragedies. A proud nation with thousands of years of culture was subjugated, exploited, and nearly culturally destroyed. Liberation brought not independence and unity but division and war. The legacy of Japanese occupation continues influencing Korean politics, society, and relations with Japan. Demands for Japanese acknowledgement and compensation for wartime atrocities remain contentious issues in East Asian politics. Mongolia played a little-known but significant role in World War II, fighting Japan before the war officially began and later invading Manchuria in 1945. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939 saw Soviet and Mongolian forces defeat Japanese forces in a border conflict that tested both sides' military capabilities. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov commanded the operation that encircled and destroyed Japanese forces, demonstrating tactics he would later use against Germany. The Japanese defeat at Khalkhin Gol convinced Japan to avoid war with the Soviet Union and instead expand southward into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This strategic decision had enormous consequences, as it meant Japan wouldn't attack the Soviet Union when Germany invaded in 1941, allowing Stalin to transfer Siberian divisions westward to defend Moscow. Mongolia maintained neutrality toward Germany but was effectively a Soviet satellite. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945, Mongolian forces joined the invasion of Manchuria. Over 80,000 Mongolian troops participated in the rapid campaign that destroyed Japanese forces in Manchuria in just days. Mongolian cavalry, operating in terrain they knew intimately, proved effective against Japanese forces. Mongolia's contribution to defeating Japan is often overlooked, but it was significant. The country provided resources, allowed Soviet military bases, and contributed troops that helped end the war in Asia. After the war, Mongolia remained a Soviet satellite throughout the Cold War, not gaining true independence until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Mongolia's role in World War II demonstrates how small nations could influence events through alliance with great powers, and how forgotten fronts and battles shaped the war's outcome in unexpected ways. Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, was established in 1932 after Japan invaded and occupied northeastern China. The state was nominally ruled by Pye, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, but actual control rested with Japanese military authorities. Manchukuo served as Japan's industrial and agricultural base, providing coal, iron, oil, and food for the Japanese war machine. The state was also a testing ground for Japanese colonial policies and military tactics. Japanese settlement was encouraged, with hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians moving to Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, Japan's elite military force stationed in Manchukuo, held enormous power and often acted independently of the Japanese government in Tokyo. This independent action led to increased aggression, including the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 that sparked full-scale war with China. Manchukuo was the site of horrific Japanese war crimes. Unit 731, the Japanese Biological Warfare Unit, conducted experiments on thousands of Chinese, Soviet, and other prisoners. These experiments included vivisection without anesthesia, testing of biological weapons, and deliberate infection with diseases. Tens of thousands died in these experiments, which rank among history's worst medical atrocities. The Japanese forces in Manchukuo also committed massacres and brutal suppression of Chinese resistance. Forced labor, sexual slavery, and systematic exploitation characterized Japanese rule. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945, Soviet forces invaded Manchukuo with overwhelming force. Over 1 million Soviet troops attacked, supported by Mongolian forces and equipped with thousands of tanks and aircraft. Japanese forces, depleted by transfers to the Pacific, collapsed within days. The speed of the Soviet invasion shocked Japan and contributed to the decision to surrender. Puyi was captured by Soviet forces and later handed to Communist China, where he spent years in re-education before being released. Manchukuo ceased to exist, and Manchuria was returned to Chinese control. The Soviet invasion demonstrated that Japan's continental empire could be crushed quickly by modern mechanized warfare. For the hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in Manchuria, the Soviet invasion was catastrophic. Many died fleeing southward. Women were raped, civilians were killed or captured. The experience traumatized Japanese society and contributed to Japanese fear of Soviets' power during the early Cold War. Manchukuo's 14-year existence as a puppet state demonstrated Japan's imperial ambitions and the brutality of Japanese occupation policies. The state served Japanese interests while exploiting Chinese resources and people. Its collapse in 1945 ended Japan's continental empire and returned Manchuria to China, where it would become a crucial industrial region for the People's Republic of China. Algeria became a crucial battleground in November 1942 when Allied forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Algeria was part of Vichy France, and Vichy forces initially resisted the Allied landings. Fighting lasted only days before Vichy commanders agreed to a ceasefire, recognizing that resistance was futile and that Allied victory would eventually liberate France. Algeria served as a staging area for Allied operations in North Africa and later the invasion of Italy. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops passed through Algerian ports. The cities of Algiers, Oran, and other ports became major logistics hubs. Airfields in Algeria supported Allied air operations across the Mediterranean. The political situation in Algeria was complex. Vichy administration had enforced anti-Jewish laws, stripping Algerian Jews of citizenship and rights. The arrival of Allied forces didn't immediately reverse these policies, causing tensions. The local French administration was divided between Vichy loyalists, Gaullist supporters, and those who simply wanted to survive. Algerian Muslims, who formed the majority of the population but were largely excluded from political power, hoped the war might bring changes to their status. Some Algerians served in French forces fighting alongside the Allies, particularly in the Italian campaign. The Algerian contribution to French military strength was significant, though these soldiers fought for a France that denied them equal rights in their own country. The war accelerated Algerian nationalism. Algerians who fought for France questioned why they should be treated as second-class citizens. The rhetoric of Allied war aims, promoting freedom and democracy, contrasted sharply with French colonial policies. In May 1945, celebrations of German surrender turned violent in Sétif and other Algerian cities when nationalist demonstrations were suppressed by French police and military. Thousands of Algerians were killed in the repression. These events are considered precursors to the Algerian War of Independence that began in 1954. Algeria emerged from World War II still under French control, but the seeds of independence had been planted. The war had weakened France, strengthened Algerian nationalism, and demonstrated that colonial empires could be defeated. Algeria would gain independence in 1962 after a brutal 8-year war that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Morocco was the landing site for Allied forces during Operation Torch in November 1942, bringing war to North Africa's Atlantic coast. Morocco was divided between Vichy French control and Spanish zones. The Allied landings at Casablanca faced brief but fierce resistance from Vichy French forces. Naval battles off the coast and fighting on the beaches killed hundreds before Vichy commanders agreed to a ceasefire. Morocco became a crucial Allied base. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 brought together Roosevelt, Churchill, and their military staffs to plan strategy. At this conference, the Allies announced their demand for unconditional surrender of Axis powers, a policy that would guide the war to its conclusion. Moroccan ports, particularly Casablanca, became major entry points for American forces and supplies entering North Africa. Tens of thousands of troops passed through Morocco on their way to Tunisia and later to Sicily and Italy. Moroccan forces fought for France in the Italian campaign and the liberation of France. The Moroccan Gumiers Berber soldiers serving in French forces gained reputations as fierce fighters. They fought at Monte Cassino and throughout the Italian mountains, suffering heavy casualties but earning respect for their combat effectiveness. However, Moroccan troops were also accused of atrocities, particularly mass rapes of Italian civilians during the Italian campaign, crimes that remain controversial and poorly acknowledged. Sultan Mohammed V of Morocco showed subtle defiance toward Vichy policies, particularly refusing to implement anti-Jewish measures as strictly as Vichy demanded. This protection of Moroccan Jews, while incomplete, saved many lives. The Sultan's wartime actions contributed to his legitimacy in the independence movement that would follow. Morocco remained under French control after the war, but nationalist movements grew stronger. Moroccan soldiers who had fought for France returned questioning why Morocco couldn't govern itself. The war had weakened French power and strengthened Moroccan national consciousness. Morocco gained independence in 1956 after negotiations rather than the prolonged war that characterized Algerian independence. The wartime Sultan became King Mohammed V of independent Morocco, ruling until 1961. Tunisia became the site of the final battles in North Africa after Allied forces invaded from the west and British forces advanced from Egypt. Tunisia was Vichy French territory until Allied invasion, then became the last Axis stronghold in Africa. German and Italian forces retreated into Tunisia after defeats at El Alamein and during the Allied advance across North Africa. Hitler poured reinforcements into Tunisia determined to hold Africa as long as possible. From November 1942 to May 1943, Fierce battles raged across Tunisia as Allied forces gradually closed the trap on Axis forces. The terrain favored defenders, with mountains and narrow passes forcing costly frontal assaults. American forces, fighting their first major battles against experienced German troops, suffered defeats at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where German counterattacks inflicted heavy casualties and exposed American inexperience. But Americans learned quickly, improving tactics and leadership. British forces advancing from the east, including Montgomery's 8th Army, pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps into Tunisia. Rommel, sick and recognizing the inevitable, was recalled to Germany in March 1943. His successor faced impossible odds. By April 1943, over 300,000 Axis troops were trapped in Tunisia with their backs to the sea. Supply convoys from Italy were decimated by Allied air and naval forces. Food, fuel, and ammunition ran short. On May 13, 1943, remaining Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. Over 240,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners, a loss comparable to Stalingrad. The North African campaign was over. Allied victory in Tunisia was strategically crucial. It secured the Mediterranean, freed shipping from having to go around Africa, and provided a springboard for invading Sicily and Italy. The campaign gave Allied forces, particularly Americans, valuable combat experience. It demonstrated Allied ability to conduct large-scale combined operations. The loss of North Africa was devastating for the Axis. Italy, already war-weary, now faced invasion across the Mediterranean. Germany lost experienced troops and equipment it couldn't replace. For Tunisia itself, the campaign brought destruction. Cities were bombed. Agricultural land was torn up by warfare. Thousands of Tunisian civilians died. After the war, Tunisia, like other French North African colonies, moved toward independence, gaining it in 1956. The wartime experience, seeing French forces defeated and then victorious only with Allied help, contributed to Tunisian nationalism and the eventual end of French colonial rule. Syria and Lebanon, under French mandate since World War I, became battlegrounds in 1941 when Vichy French forces allowed German aircraft to use Syrian airfields to support the Iraqi coup. Britain and Free French forces invaded in June 1941 to prevent Syria and Lebanon from becoming Axis bases threatening British positions in the Middle East. The Syria-Lebanon campaign lasted 5 weeks and pitted former allies against each other. Vichy French forces, including French Foreign Legion units, fought determinedly against British, Commonwealth, Indian, and Free French forces. The fighting was bitter, with neither side giving quarter. Over 3,000 casualties on each side demonstrated the intensity of combat. Australian forces captured Damascus. Indian troops fought in the mountains. Free French forces fought their Vichy counterparts in battles that were as much about post-war French politics as military objectives. Many Vichy French soldiers resented being attacked by fellow Frenchmen and British forces they considered allies until recently. When Vichy forces surrendered in July 1941, they were given the choice of joining Free French forces or being repatriated. Most chose repatriation, refusing to fight alongside de Gaulle's forces. The campaign secured Syria and Lebanon from Axis use and protected British positions, but it created political complications. Free French forces occupied Syria and Lebanon, but nationalist movements in both countries demanded independence. The Free French, having promised independence to gain local support during the fighting, faced pressure to fulfill those promises. Syria and Lebanon both declared independence in 1943, though French forces remained until after the war. In 1945, when France tried to reassert control, nationalist uprisings and British pressure forced French withdrawal. Syria and Lebanon gained true independence in 1946. Two nations created from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, briefly ruled by France, and freed by a world war that destroyed European colonial power. The war in Syria and Lebanon demonstrated how global conflict created opportunities for colonized peoples to gain independence. It also showed the complexity of wartime alliances, with French fighting French, former allies becoming enemies, and colonial subjects fighting for powers that denied them independence. Libya was Italy's North African colony and the site of years of desert warfare between Axis and Allied forces. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Italian forces in Libya invaded Egypt, seeking to capture the Suez Canal. The invasion quickly stalled, and British forces counterattacked in December 1940, pushing deep into Libya and capturing over 130,000 Italian prisoners. The victories were spectacular and seemed to show Italian military incompetence. But Germany sent reinforcements under General Erwin Rommel, who arrived in Libya in February 1941 and transformed the Desert War. Rommel's Afrika Korps, combining German professionalism with Italian numbers, pushed British forces back to the Egyptian border. For the next 2 years, the war in Libya swayed back and forth across the desert as both sides advanced and retreated based on supply situations and reinforcements. The fighting was mobile warfare at its finest, with tank battles, flanking maneuvers, and long-range raids characterizing operations. Tobruk, a Libyan port, was besieged by Axis forces for over 7 months in 1941, with Australian and other Commonwealth forces holding out against repeated attacks. The siege became legendary, and the defenders earned the nickname Rats of Tobruk. Rommel captured Tobruk in June 1942, taking over 30,000 prisoners, but this was his high-water mark. At El Alamein in Egypt, Montgomery's 8th Army defeated Rommel in October-November 1942, beginning the final Allied advance. By January 1943, British forces had liberated Libya and were pursuing Axis forces into Tunisia. The Desert War in Libya was characterized by mutual respect between opponents. Rommel, despite serving Nazi Germany, gained respect for his military skill and relatively humane treatment of prisoners. British commanders admired his tactical abilities even while fighting him. The war devastated Libya's limited infrastructure and disrupted the lives of Libya's indigenous population, who were caught between foreign armies fighting across their land. After the war, Libya remained under British and French administration until gaining independence in 1951. The wartime destruction and the end of Italian colonialism reshaped Libya's future, though the country would face decades of instability and dictatorship under Muammar Gaddafi before the Arab Spring and subsequent civil war. Luxembourg was tiny but symbolically important as one of Hitler's first victims. Germany invaded Luxembourg on May 10, 1940, the same day as Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Luxembourg had no army capable of resisting, and the government fled to exile. Grand Duchess Charlotte and the government established themselves in London, maintaining Luxembourg's independence in exile and inspiring resistance at home. German occupation of Luxembourg was harsh. The country was annexed into Germany and subjected to Germanization policies. Luxembourgers were forced to speak German, serve in the German military, and accept Nazi rule. Resistance emerged despite the risks. The Luxembourg resistance conducted sabotage, gathered intelligence, and helped Allied pilots escape. A general strike in September 1942 protested forced conscription of Luxembourgers into the German military. German reprisals were brutal, with strike leaders executed and hundreds deported to concentration camps. Luxembourg's men conscripted into the Wehrmacht faced impossible moral dilemmas. Some deserted at the first opportunity, others fought because they had no choice. Some joined the Waffen-SS and participated in atrocities, creating post-war controversies about collaboration and coercion. Luxembourg was liberated by American forces in September 1944, but the Battle of the Bulge brought German forces back into northern Luxembourg in December 1944. The town of Bastogne, just across the border in Belgium, became famous for the American defense, but Luxembourg territory was also fought over in this final German offensive. Final liberation came in February 1945. Luxembourg emerged from the war devastated. Over 2% of its population had died, a higher percentage than most larger nations. The experience convinced Luxembourg to abandon neutrality. After the war, Luxembourg became a founding member of NATO and the European Economic Community, hosting European institutions and embracing international cooperation to prevent future wars. Luxembourg's wartime suffering, despite its small size, demonstrated that no nation was too small for Nazi brutality or too insignificant to resist. Albania experienced multiple occupations during World War II, first by Italy, then by Germany, and throughout by resistance movements that foreshadowed post-war communist rule. Italy invaded Albania in April 1939, quickly overwhelming Albanian forces and forcing King Zog into exile. Albania was annexed into the Italian Empire, with Victor Emmanuel III of Italy becoming King of Albania. Italian rule was initially relatively mild compared to German occupation elsewhere, but it was still colonial exploitation. When Italy invaded Greece from Albania in October 1940 and was defeated, Greek forces occupied southern Albania. The humiliation of Italian defeat led to increased German involvement in the Balkans. After Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, Germany occupied Albania, replacing Italian with German control. German occupation was harsher than Italian. Albanian resistance intensified, with communist partisans led by Enver Hoxha becoming the most effective resistance force. The partisan movement fought both German occupiers and rival nationalist resistance groups, waging simultaneous war against foreign occupation and internal civil war. Albanian partisans received support from British special operations but maintained independence, unlike resistance movements elsewhere that were more closely controlled by Allied powers. By the time German forces withdrew in November 1944, Hoxha's communists had defeated both German forces and rival Albanian factions. The communists established control, and Hoxha became Albania's dictator, a position he held until his death in 1985. Albanians' wartime experience was unique. The country experienced Italian and German occupation but was never liberated by Allied forces. Instead, indigenous forces liberated themselves, creating a communist state that would become one of the world's most isolated and repressive. Hox's Albania broke with the Soviet Union in the 1960s, and with China in the 1970s, pursuing a paranoid hermetic path that impoverished the country and terrorized its population. World War II gave Albanian communists the opportunity to seize power, leading to 46 years of dictatorship that only ended with communism's collapse in 1991. The war's legacy in Albania was thus not liberation but a different form of tyranny. Bulgaria entered World War II as an Axis ally but followed a unique path that saw it fight alongside Germany without declaring war on the Soviet Union, and ultimately switched sides in 1944. Bulgaria joined the Axis in March 1941, hoping to regain territories lost in previous wars, particularly Macedonia from Yugoslavia and Thrace from Greece. Bulgarian troops occupied these territories when Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. Though Bulgarian forces didn't participate in the invasions themselves, Bulgaria's alliance with Germany was pragmatic rather than ideological. King Boris III walked a diplomatic tightrope, supporting Germany enough to maintain the alliance and territorial gains but resisting German pressure to participate fully in the war effort. Crucially, Bulgaria never declared war on the Soviet Union, maintaining diplomatic relations even while allied with Germany. This decision proved vital to Bulgaria's post-war fate. Bulgarian forces fought against Western Allied bombing raids and occupied territories in Greece and Yugoslavia, suppressing resistance movements. But Bulgaria's treatment of Jews was remarkable and unique among Axis nations. Despite German pressure and anti-Semitic laws, Bulgaria refused to deport its 48,000 Jewish citizens to death camps. When deportation orders were issued, protests from Bulgarian Orthodox church leaders, intellectuals, and parliamentarians forced the government to back down. Bulgarian Jews survived the war, almost alone among Jewish populations in Axis nations. However, Bulgaria did deport over 11,000 Jews from occupied Macedonia and Thrace to Treblinka, where nearly all were murdered. This moral complexity, saving Bulgarian Jews while surrendering foreign Jews to death, remains controversial. King Boris III died mysteriously in August 1943, shortly after meeting with Hitler. Rumors suggested German assassination, though illness is the likely cause. As Soviet forces approached Bulgaria in September 1944, the Bulgarian government attempted to negotiate neutrality, but the Soviet Union declared war and invaded. Within days, a communist coup overthrew the government. Bulgaria switched sides, joining the Allies and declaring war on Germany. Bulgarian forces fought alongside Soviet forces in Yugoslavia and Hungary, suffering thousands of casualties in the final year of the war. After the war, Bulgaria became a Soviet satellite. The monarchy was abolished, and a communist regime was established that lasted until 1989. Bulgaria's unique wartime path, allied with Germany but protecting its Jews and never fighting the Soviets, allowed it to escape some of the harshest post-war retributions, though it still fell under Soviet control for 45 years. Latvia was one of the Baltic states occupied successively by the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and again by the Soviet Union, experiencing brutal treatment from both totalitarian powers. Latvia had gained independence after World War I, but the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 assigned the Baltic states to the Soviet sphere of influence. In June 1940, Soviet forces occupied Latvia, which was annexed into the Soviet Union. Soviet occupation brought mass arrests, deportations, and executions. In June 1941, just days before German invasion, Soviet authorities deported over 15,000 Latvians to Siberia, killing many and condemning others to slow death in labor camps. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, many Latvians initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Soviet occupation, but Nazi policies quickly disillusioned them. Latvia was incorporated into Reichskommissariat Ostland under German civilian administration. The tiny Latvian Jewish community, about 70,000 people, was almost entirely murdered, primarily by German forces with some local collaboration. Latvian auxiliary units, formed by Germans, participated in the Holocaust both in Latvia and elsewhere in occupied territories. The Orojas Commando, a Latvian collaborationist unit, murdered thousands of Jews in Latvia and Belarus. These crimes remain painful and controversial in Latvian history. However, many Latvians also resisted both occupations. Partisan groups fought against both Soviet and German forces. As Soviet forces returned in 1944, some Latvians fought alongside Germans, seeing the Soviets as the greater threat. Others fled westward, becoming refugees. Tens of thousands of Latvians ended up in displaced persons camps in the West, eventually emigrating to the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries. Soviet reoccupation in 1944 brought renewed terror. Mass deportations resumed. Over 200,000 Latvians were killed, deported, or fled during the Soviet occupations. Latvian resistance, the Forest Brothers, continued guerrilla warfare against Soviet occupation into the early 1950s. though they had no hope of victory. Latvia remained under Soviet control until 1991. The war cost Latvia over 100,000 dead and 200,000 refugees or deportees. The country lost over a third of its population. The double occupation by two totalitarian powers remains the defining trauma of modern Latvian history. Latvia regained independence in 1991 and joined NATO and the European Union, seeking security against Russia that World War II had destroyed. Lithuania shared Latvia's tragic fate, occupied by the Soviets, then the Germans, then the Soviets again, each occupation bringing murder and deportation. Lithuania had been independent since World War I but was occupied by the Soviet Union in June 1940 and annexed. Soviet occupation brought arrests of Lithuanian political leaders, intellectuals, and military officers. In June 1941, Soviet authorities deported over 17,000 Lithuanians to Siberia in cattle cars, separating families and condemning many to death. When Germany invaded Lithuania on June 22, 1941, some Lithuanians saw it as an opportunity to escape Soviet rule. However, Lithuania was integrated into a German-controlled area, and its independence was not restored. This period was marked by significant challenges for the Lithuanian people. Over 200,000 Lithuanian Jews, 95% of the pre-war Jewish population, were murdered, primarily in mass shootings rather than deportation to camps. German Einsatzgruppen supported by Lithuanian auxiliary police conducted the murders. The 9th Fort in Kaunas and the Ponary Forest near Vilnius became killing sites where tens of thousands were shot and buried in mass graves. Lithuanian collaboration in the Holocaust was extensive and remains a painful subject. However, some Lithuanians risked their lives to save Jews. Lithuania has more righteous among the nations, non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust, per capita, than most nations. As Soviet forces returned in 1944, Lithuanians faced impossible choices. Some fled westward. Some fought alongside Germans. Some tried to remain neutral. Soviet reoccupation brought renewed terror. Mass deportations resumed, with over 300,000 Lithuanians deported to Siberia between 1944 and 1953. The Forest Brothers, Lithuanian partisans, waged guerrilla war against Soviet occupation into the 1950s, one of the longest and most determined anti-Soviet resistance movements. The Soviets eventually crushed them through brutal repression and infiltration. Lithuania lost over 300,000 people to war, Holocaust and deportations, roughly 15% of its population. Independence came only in 1991. The experience of double occupation and the Holocaust remains central to Lithuanian national identity. The complex history of collaboration, resistance, and survival continues to be debated. Lithuania, like Latvia, joined NATO and the European Union immediately upon regaining full sovereignty, seeking protection against Russia. Estonia completed the trio of Baltic states devastated by successive Soviet and German occupations. Estonia had enjoyed independence from 1918 to 1940 but was occupied by the Soviet Union in June 1940 following the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Soviet occupation brought arrests, executions, and in June 1941, mass deportation of over 10,000 Estonians to Siberia. When Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, many Estonians welcomed German forces as liberators. Estonian guerrillas, the Forest Brothers, had already begun fighting against Soviet forces. Some Estonians hoped Germany would restore Estonian independence, but Nazi Germany had no intention of restoring Baltic independence. Estonia was incorporated into Reichskommissariat Ostland under German administration. Still, German occupation was initially less oppressive than Soviet. Estonians could use their language and maintain some cultural institutions. Estonian SS units were formed, and tens of thousands of Estonians served in German military formations, primarily fighting Soviet forces. This service was motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment rather than Nazi ideology for most Estonians. Estonia's Jewish population was small, about 4,000 people, but 95% were murdered during German occupation. German forces and Estonian collaborators conducted the killings. However, Estonia also had examples of resistance to the Holocaust, with some Estonians hiding Jews or helping them escape. As Soviet forces returned in 1944, thousands of Estonians fled across the Baltic Sea to Sweden or Germany. Those who remained faced Soviet reoccupation. Mass deportations resumed, with over 30,000 Estonians deported to Siberia in the late 1940s. Estonian Forest Brothers continued guerrilla warfare against Soviet occupation into the 1950s. The last Estonian partisan, August Saab, evaded capture until 1978, when he was killed by Soviet forces. Estonia lost over 70,000 people, about 8% of its population, to war, Holocaust, deportations, and flight. The country remained under Soviet occupation until 1991. Estonia regained independence during the Soviet collapse and quickly oriented toward the West, joining NATO and the European Union. The Estonian experience in World War II, caught between two totalitarian powers, shaped national identity and created deep suspicion of Russia that continues today. Iceland was invaded and occupied by the Allies to prevent German seizure of this strategic island. Iceland had been independent since 1918, though still in personal union with Denmark. When Germany occupied Denmark in April 1940, Iceland's status became uncertain. Britain, fearing Germany would occupy Iceland and use it as a base for attacks on shipping, invaded Iceland on May 10, 1940. The same day Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The British invasion was peaceful, with no Icelandic resistance. Icelandic authorities protested the violation of neutrality but cooperated under duress. About 25,000 British troops occupied the island, more than the entire adult male population of Iceland at the time. The presence of foreign troops in a small, isolated society created social tensions. American forces replaced British troops in July 1941. Before the United States officially entered the war, Iceland became a crucial base for anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Aircraft and ships operating from Iceland could patrol the mid-Atlantic gap that land-based aircraft from Britain or North America couldn't reach. This coverage was vital to protecting convoys and defeating German U-boats. Iceland remained occupied throughout the war, with tens of thousands of Allied personnel stationed there. The economic impact was enormous for Iceland's small economy. Employment and income surged. Infrastructure was built, but social changes were controversial, particularly relationships between Icelandic women and foreign soldiers. In 1944, while still occupied by American forces, Iceland held a referendum and declared full independence, dissolving the union with Denmark and becoming a republic. Allied occupation had demonstrated Iceland's vulnerability but also its strategic importance. After the war, Iceland joined NATO in 1949 despite having no military, recognizing that neutrality couldn't protect it. American forces remained in Iceland throughout the Cold War. Iceland's World War II experience was unique, invaded by allies, occupied to protect it from enemies, enriched economically and enabled to achieve full independence. The war transformed Iceland from an isolated poor island into a modern nation integrated into the Western Alliance. Ireland, officially neutral throughout World War II, maintained a precarious neutrality called the emergency that involved covert cooperation with the Allies. Irish neutrality was driven by determination to assert independence from Britain and by the unresolved partition of Ireland, with Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. Eamon de Valera, Ireland's leader, refused to join the war, despite British pressure, arguing that Irish neutrality was essential to Irish sovereignty. However, Irish neutrality favored the Allies in practice. Ireland shared intelligence with Britain, particularly about German U-boat movements. Irish weather reports were crucial for Allied planning, including the DDI invasion. Downed Allied pilots who crashed in Ireland were quietly returned across the border to Northern Ireland, while German pilots were interned for the war's duration. Irish citizens, despite neutrality, could travel freely to Britain and join British forces. Over 50,000 Irish volunteered for British military service, and over 5,000 died fighting for Britain. Irish workers traveled to Britain to fill labor shortages, supporting British war industry. Dublin was accidentally bombed by German aircraft in 1941, killing 34 people. But Ireland didn't declare war, maintaining neutrality even when attacked. De Valera controversially visited the German embassy to offer condolences when Hitler died, a gesture that was widely criticized as moral blindness to Nazi crimes. Irish neutrality was pragmatic but morally complex. Ireland remained safe from invasion and avoided the devastation other European nations suffered. But neutrality meant standing aside while Britain, despite their fraught history, fought for survival. After the war, Ireland's neutrality was criticized, particularly regarding the Holocaust. Ireland had restricted Jewish immigration during the war, turning away refugees who would later die in death camps. But neutrality also preserved Irish sovereignty and democracy when many European nations lost both. Ireland remained neutral during the Cold War as well, never joining NATO though it quietly cooperated with the West. The wartime neutrality remains controversial in Irish history, balancing Irish sovereignty and survival against moral questions about standing aside from the fight against Nazism. Nepal contributed the legendary Gurkha soldiers who fought with distinction in nearly every theater of World War II. Nepal was independent, but had close relations with Britain through treaties allowing Gurkha recruitment. When war began, Nepal immediately offered support. Over 200,000 Gurkhas served in British and Indian army units during the war. Gurkhas fought in North Africa, Italy, Greece, Malaya, Burma, and throughout Asia. Their reputation for courage, endurance, and skill with the kukri knife made them among the most respected soldiers of the war. In North Africa, Gurkha units fought at El Alamein and throughout the Desert Campaign. In Italy, they fought through mountains and against determined German resistance. In Burma and Malaya, Gurkhas fought in jungle conditions that tested even their remarkable endurance. The Chindit's British long-range penetration forces included many Gurkha units operating behind Japanese lines. Gurkhas earned numerous decorations for valor, including 26 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor. Their contribution was vital to British military effectiveness in Asia. About 30,000 Gurkhas were killed or wounded during the war. After the war, Britain continued recruiting Gurkhas, and Gurkha regiments remain part of the British Army today. Nepal emerged from the war with its independence intact and its military reputation enhanced. The wartime service strengthened British-Nepalese relations while demonstrating that a small Himalayan kingdom could have global military impact through the quality of its soldiers. Anglo-Egyptian Sudan served as a crucial logistics base and staging area for operations in East Africa and the Middle East. Sudan, under joint British-Egyptian administration, contributed troops, resources, and territory for Allied operations. Sudanese soldiers served in British forces, particularly in the East African campaign against Italian forces in Ethiopia. The Sudan Defense Force, though small, fought effectively in difficult terrain. Sudan's geographic position made it strategically important. Supply routes from the Red Sea through Sudan supported operations in East Africa. Sudan provided agricultural products, particularly cotton, essential for military supplies. The war brought economic development and infrastructure improvements, though these primarily served British military needs. Sudanese nationalism grew during the war, as educated Sudanese questioned why they should support the British Empire's war while denied self. The war accelerated the independence movement that would eventually succeed in 1956. Sudan's contribution to Allied victory is often overlooked, but the country played important supporting roles in East African and Middle Eastern campaigns. Thousands of Sudanese served in uniform, and Sudan's resources supported Allied forces throughout the region. Sudan Anglo-Egyptian forces also participated in the invasion of Italian East Africa, where they fought in the liberation of Ethiopia from Italian occupation. The terrain was challenging, with operations conducted in mountains and desert. Sudanese troops demonstrated effectiveness in these operations, contributing to the complete collapse of Italian East African forces by 1941. After the war, Sudan moved toward independence, which came in 1956. The wartime experience had exposed Sudanese soldiers and workers to modern warfare and politics, contributing to nationalist movements. Britain emerged from the war too weak to maintain its African colonies, and Sudan, like other colonies, gained independence in the post-war wave of decolonization. Sudan's World War II experience was part of the broader story of how the war destroyed European colonial empires and enabled independence movements across Africa and Asia. Sudan's contribution, while numerically modest, was symbolically important. African soldiers fighting for colonial powers against Axis forces raised questions about colonialism and self-determination. If Africans were good enough to fight and die for the British Empire, why weren't they good enough to govern themselves? These questions would drive decolonization in the post-war era. The irony wasn't lost on Sudanese or other African soldiers. They fought for freedom in Europe while denied freedom at home. This contradiction helped fuel the independence movements that swept Africa after 1945. World War II, despite its horrific cost, had one unintended positive consequence. It destroyed European colonial empires. The war weakened colonial powers economically and militarily. It empowered colonized peoples who had fought alongside or instead of their colonizers. It established principles of self-determination in the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations Charter. The colonial world that existed in 1939 had largely disappeared by 1975. The war had made European colonialism unsustainable. For countries like Sudan, the war years were a transition period between colonial rule and independence. The experience of the war, the exposure to modern organization and politics, the demonstration that colonizers were not invincible, all contributed to the rapid decolonization that followed. Sudan and dozens of other nations emerged from the war still colonized, but with growing confidence that independence was achievable. Within 2 decades, most had achieved it, transforming the map of the world and ending the era of European global dominance. World War II thus had consequences far beyond the immediate military conflict. It reshaped the entire global order, ending empires, creating new nations, and establishing patterns of power and politics that would define the rest of the 20th century and continue influencing the 21st. These 59 nations, from global empires to tiny kingdoms, from industrial powerhouses to agricultural colonies, all played roles in World War II. Each has its own story of sacrifice, survival, collaboration, or resistance. Together, they created the most devastating conflict in human history, killing 70 to 85 million people and reshaping the world forever. The war destroyed fascism in Europe and militarism in Japan. It ended European colonial empires. It created the United Nations and established human rights principles. It began the atomic age and the Cold War. It demonstrated humanity's capacity for both unimaginable evil and remarkable courage. Understanding all 59 countries involved helps us grasp the true scope of this global conflict and remember that World War II affected every inhabited continent and touched billions of lives across the planet.